In the dead, deep halls of the Eternal Cycle dungeon on March 26th, a shaken Kacharo Shimizu snapped that this was just how it had to be, at least for now. While he stared at the calm Hymengriva Albion, an unseen intelligence flagged his "for now" words as suspicious and totally unreadable. And then an older commanding man demanded a full talk, especially about Hymengriva's power, right as the whole scene ripped backward, rewinding exactly one day. Moments later, the story snapped back to the day before March 25th, 5 p.m., and zoomed straight into Kyotaro's room in the Shimizu house, where he was in total meltdown, flinging himself onto the bed and yelling that he just couldn't take it anymore. Still seething from his outburst, Kyotaro kept shouting, and that's when Fumika, the young woman, burst into his room to slam him with a warning about all the noise he was causing, saying he'd wake up the whole neighborhood stunned. Kyotaro stammered an apology and tried to explain himself, but Fumika just stared at him, eyes sharp with questions. She shot him a question, "Were you crying?" And he snapped quick as a blink, "No." But his face was beet red. Then, all awkward hesitation, he asked if they'd met somewhere before, and Fumika just stared, totally baffled, like, "What kind of prank is this?" A jolt of realization hit Kyochiro, and he blurted out with a sharp gasp, "Fumika-san!" only for her to look totally lost, as his stiff, formal words and the way he pointed made her squint in confusion. He snapped into a stern warning that he better not mess around or point at people for no reason, because Big Sis would get furious. Kyochiro panicked, apologized fast, and fumbled out a nervous nod to Big Sis. He jerked in surprise and blurted out a question when Icon Fumika, in an apron and cute cat ear hair clips, grinned warmly and told him, "Yep, it's me, your big sister Kickin'." Still, he couldn't shake the feeling and stared, comparing their faces like he'd met two strangers, wondering why they looked so wildly different, almost like ghosts. He kept staring in shock, realizing he had no clue that Fumika-san was his older sister, and when she saw his face, she softly asked if he'd been crying because she thought they didn't look alike, before pointing out the truth. They actually shared the same look, especially the way their hair splits. While Kyochiro wrestled with his own confusion, a ponytailed girl blurted out that she was insanely jealous. He had such a cute sister, and he immediately went red, scrambling to fix his words with every honorific under the sun for big sister Aniki N. Naisan. Meanwhile, Fumika, cheeks burning, cut in that it was time for dinner, and the other girl stared like, "Why are you acting so weird, and why are you using those strange nicknames again?" Soon, a big hearty dinner hit the table so delicious it practically begged to be eaten, and with sparkling eyes he dug in and thanked everyone for the meal. With chopsticks poised like weapons, he dove into the meal with hungry determination, eager to tear in. Meanwhile, his sister dug into her food with calm grace, and the whole scene shimmered with a soft, magical sparkle around her. As they kept eating, he suddenly grabbed the moment and asked Fumika what year it was on the imperial calendar, Kuriki 1189. She answered, stunned by the curveball, and he admitted he was terrible with details and had totally spaced it. The ponytail girl teased him for how forgetful he was, like it was no surprise he couldn't keep basic things straight. Then he blurted out Fumiko's age, realizing if she really was Kureki 1189, she definitely wouldn't be in high school, she'd be in general education. Fumiko confirmed it and asked why he was firing off such formal questions until he finally admitted it was for a school assignment, where he had to spell out his family structure. His sister, still shoveling food into her mouth, suddenly clocked it. His earlier question about the calendar year was tied to his assignment. Then he watched her keep eating at breakneck speed, wondering if she was really that hungry or if something else was going on. Then he crunched the numbers from the year and realized he was 14, so he'd landed in secondary school. Fumika stared at him, worry creeping up, asking if he was really okay, because he talked about himself like he felt nothing at all. He shot back, "Wait, yes," and blurted "Nay, Sam," as if it surprised him too. He just couldn't stop fixating on the imperial calendar's year, and no matter how hard he tried, his half-broken memory refused to give it back until Fumika, all smiles, gushed that today's soup tasted unreal, and the high ponytail girl nearby elbowed Kyochiro and joked she'd only hype him up so much, then added, laughing, that she even managed to hide her own mess in the chaos. Yet somehow, he still came out cute. As the meal wrapped up, he jumped in to help with the dishes so fast The ponytail girl blinked in surprise, and Fumika didn't just notice she beamed, patted his head, and told him how much he'd grown up. Moments later, Fumika crumpled to the ground, clutching her chest and insisting it was just a cold that would fade until Coyote Ro's face snapped hard, because he knew better if his memory was right. This wasn't sickness at all. It was a curse. Then his thoughts got hijacked by a nightmare, some skeletal figure in a cloak of darkness, scythe raised, hanging over helpless Fumika, and the truth hit like a punch. In just 3 years, the curse would swallow her whole, leave her incurable, and end with her dead. And he couldn't forget that past choice he made to save his sister, even though she'd been fading day by day ever since. That sin crashed into his mind like blood on glass, a brutal reminder of the exact doom it had carved for him. He realized the curse was stacking resistance to every treatment, and then a cold thought clawed at his mind. What if it was already turning him into the next victim? Clutching Fumika's hand tight, he announced his choice with a voice so steady it sounded unbreakable. His eyes blazed with raw determination as he swore to smash every ridiculous rule this world threw at him and refuse the true history that was trying to erase them. Later, he sank into his couch while a cheerful anchor blared a fresh weather report: clear skies tomorrow in Sakurabana, the kind of perfect day for camping with your contract spirit. Then the screen switched gears and teased the beginner adventurer trial happening in April, begging anyone interested to apply fast, before ending with a spotlight on a low-ranked spirit contract set as today's top pick for rookie adventurers. He stared at the Shimizu residence and realized deep down what home really meant, because it sat inside Dungeon City Sakurabana, a whole residential district packed with weird spaces, twisting labyrinths, and resources society couldn't survive without. Beyond those dungeons, he already knew the truth. This world wasn't just dangerous. It was powered by spirits. Their existence stitched the world's fabric together, letting people pull off supernatural magic by borrowing spirit power. But he didn't have a spirit contract yet, so for now, his only weapon wasn't that at all. He carried a secret so deep that he alone held the world's truth and the future's secrets no one else even knew existed. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and ran through every shot he had for Fumika's curse. Maybe spirit power could still stop it if it hadn't gone too far. Maybe a real curse breaker could take the heat off. Maybe even a universal healing potion could force it back. He was sure the right item or the right person could snap the curse in two. So he started mapping where he might even find them. And then the reality hit hard. He had 0 connections, 0 allies, and nobody coming to help. He couldn't stop picturing his older sister beautiful, angelic, yet his situation felt crushing. As for finding the person he wanted, he had 0 way to reach them. And the place that might hold a universal healing potion, too dangerous for him to face alone. Alone, he snapped to one brutal question: should he trust the spirit's power himself? He knew that in 3 years he'd finally awaken spirit powers, but then he'd just be a total nobody, way too weak to even snag that life-or-death item. He shot up, then sprang out of bed with his thoughts sprinting. He knew exactly what he needed, but the real problem was which spirit he should go after. He started laying out his rules first. A spirit strong enough to snag a curse-breaking item, maybe even a universal healing potion second. One powerful enough to heal Fumika straight up in third, something he could actually get right now, not some fantasy impossible to reach. With a fierce look, he snapped that he didn't care if the method was humiliating or trashy. If it could save Fumika's life, he'd need a busted, cheat-level spirit, the kind even someone like him could actually pull off. He fired back with tricks and cheats, daring the whole idea to fall apart. Ready to do whatever it took. He froze for a beat, a smug smirk tugging at his lips as a key detail snapped into place. Wait, he thought. I've got it. His eyes flared wide with fierce resolve as he stared 3 years into the future, chasing the incredible spirit he'd somehow find. If the stars lined up, then Fumika crashed back into his mind, the curse chewing through her body until she was teetering on death, and her final desperate plea still ringing in his ears. Please offer flowers to God. He remembered the key she'd slipped into his hand, the one that opened that special place, and Fumika, teetering on the edge, admitted she didn't think she could last much longer on her own. That cursed key shoved him toward an ancient, abandoned shrine right where a cheat-class spirit was lurking, and part of him, even with his limits, thought he might actually be able to face it. Now he had to grab the right items and follow the exact route he already knew, because from here on out, it was pure race against the clock. Hyo felt triumph rip through him. He'd cracked a slim theoretical route that might work with what he knew, if he was willing to gamble everything, even his life. He decided he'd push through it no matter what it cost, but deep down, a nasty doubt crawled in. He didn't know the Shizuka siblings at all, so why was he risking everything for them? Next morning, Hyo showed up at the door of a traditional home and greeted Fumika, then blurted out an apology for worrying her, insisting he was totally fine before catching himself and calling her sis. Fumika immediately asked how he was doing. Fumika clocked the dark circles under his eyes and asked, "Are you okay?" And he admitted he'd been up all night, plotting strategy for a game. She gently scolded him to take a break from gaming. He nodded along, and then right when things seemed calm, he said he needed to borrow something from her. He stood before that giant shrouded statue, squared up, and told himself, "I'm going to try." He clutched a scrap of paper and recited the lines about a heaven-born light that touches everything, and a curtain of time so dark it has no glow, because he knew those words were the master key to plunge deeper inside. The trick came from a relic called the Ancient Book of Transcendence, the one real thing he couldn't possibly get in his current state. Even though it was just a copied memory, Hyo still screamed, begging the right voice to answer, begging for his sister to be saved, his face twisted in raw anguish, tears pouring non-stop as he clawed for a miracle with everything he had. Driven by his desperate plea, a hexagonal interface suddenly burst into existence, flashing an activation protocol for all to see. Kyo recoiled in shock when the system flashed that biometric authentication was done, and right beside him, Fumika's faint, ethereal image shimmered to life, translucent, ghost-like, and totally unreal. As Fumika's ethereal form steadied for a moment, the system kept scanning, catching the DNA of the dead, and verifying the surface had shifted. Then Pio's body erupted into a harsh glow, his face twisted with pure agony and shock when the jump into a four-dimensional domain finally kicked off. At exactly 12 p.m. on March 26th, Kyo got yanked into the eternal reincarnation area, and he just stared. Towering clockwork structures and spiral staircases twisted the rules of reality itself. Then he spotted a younger, grinning version of him, and that happy copy practically shouted the name of this new realm, the eternal reincarnation. He blinked into a massive, maze-like structure and instantly felt the danger. This place was built to yank you back to the start if you took even one wrong turn. Then a voice boomed through the halls, warning him the moment he'd stepped in that he wasn't playing. Yet this challenge had already locked onto him. Sure, the map said, the third floor, far right door was the answer, but every area threw him a brutal choice of 12 options, and he had to survive all 12 of those areas. After making it to Area 2, he realized he still had loads of time until he glanced at a nearby clock and saw the catch. He had to pull off 12 straight wins, and it all had to happen within 1 hour before the hands overlapped again, and that gut punch hit so hard he muttered a curse. He leaned toward the corner and peeked around it with tense focus, his eyes sweeping the area right in front of him. Right there, he clocked a guard, an absolute wall of armor. For a heartbeat, he thought about charging into a fight, like maybe that was his only shot. But he shut the idea down fast. He couldn't ruin this and lose his chance to face the spirit again. This was it, his one and only opening. He watched the pattern with sharp eyes. It always glanced back after exactly 3 steps. Step 1, step 2, and when it hit that third stride, Hugh's moment finally detonated. He bolted past the unsuspecting guard, grabbed the opening, and charged forward, only to realize Area 2 wasn't a simple route at all. It was a twisting maze that kept forcing him to pick the right way every single time he burst into a wide-open room. Sweat dripped down his brow as he scrambled to remember the exact order: left, then right, then straight down the middle. He sprinted down the corridors, pure determination driving every step, because he knew that after turning right twice, the blue door would be waiting ahead, leading straight to the next stage. Time was screaming for mercy, but he trusted his steady pace. He could still pull this off, even with a plan. The second stretch hit hard, so he forced his breath to slow and his mind to stay cool. He grabbed a quick drink, reset his energy, and then declared, loud and ready, "I'm set for the next area." His journey raged on through a wild lineup of brutal, twisty environments, each one throwing fresh obstacles and secret routes at him, driving him deeper and deeper into the endless cycle of reincarnation. At 12:48 p.m. on March 26th, he finally burst into Area 11 of Eternal Reincarnation, glanced at the clock, and felt his shoulders drop. There were still over 10 minutes left before the limit crushed him. He couldn't wrap his mind around how far he'd fought to reach this point, and there was a brutal reason he'd been obsessed with the time. The weapon for the final stage only shows up the first time you enter this dungeon, and even then, you've got just one brutal hour to grab it before it's gone forever. He gripped the rare dagger, and its intricate design flared in the light as he instantly recognized it as the Seal Blade. Levitine then, a quick, hazy memory of a beautiful pink-haired girl flashed in his mind, and he remembered her staring at the weapon like it was just as breathtaking. Then he stepped into a huge, empty hall, eyes locked on a far-off door, a cocky smirk burning on his lips as he announced he was finally ready to face Vedafnir, the guardian of the Forbidden Zone, and swore that with this blade, even the toughest monster wouldn't have a shot. Moments later, he snapped into a face-to-face standoff with the Area 12 Colossus Vitifnir, an armored giant that towered over him like a nightmare, and right there he realized the battle had started, and so had his bad arrogance. Vitifnir's sheer size hit him like a punch up close. It was unimaginably immense. Doubt surged through him, screaming, "How is a nobody weakling like Shimizu Kajuro supposed to beat something this monstrous?" His knees buckled and shook, and panic clawed at his chest, urging him to bolt and flee the moment still clutching Levitine like it could save him. Drenched in pain and worn to the bone, his mind slipped straight to the one person he loved most, his sister, and he remembered her gentle heart, her killer cooking, and that adorable little weakness for seconds, while inside him, a glowing piece of himself erupted with one desperate command: save her, no matter what. Even with fear screaming at him to run, Q clenched his resolve and decided to move, because he knew if he charged Vitifnir with no plan, he'd just get smashed by the monster's first full brute strike. And since he can't fly, aerial attacks are a death sentence, but he was sure he'd clocked the timing of that opening hit, so he sprinted like his life depended on it, gambling everything on speed to survive. As Kyo kept sprinting through desperation, Vithnir tore loose with overwhelming power, blasting him with a blinding wave of Imperial Rage. The Imperial Wrath was a death sentence for the unready. Once it hit, it permanently sucked the spirit energy dry. Heel collapsed, choking for air, his body screaming with pain as the attack devoured what little he had left. He realized his training meant nothing in this fight, and that he was already doomed from the start. Zero spirit energy. Still, that defiant spark flared in his chest. Even battered and worn out, Hyo snapped into focus because one perfect, well-timed blow was all he needed. He clung to Vitifnir's very first move like a lifeline and waited to unleash the Levitine the instant that brief opening flickered into existence. Kyo's resolve snapped into overdrive. He shot forward with wide, blazing eyes, ready to unleash the single game-ending strike. Yo unleashed the Levitine its power, causal severance, ripped through anything the blade even brushed, so he knew this was his shot to take down Vitifnir and finally stop being a loser. With a savage roar, Hugh swore he'd win no matter what. Then the Levitine raked through Vitifnir, slashing hard enough to trigger a brutal wave of cuts that shredded the colossal guardian. He screamed his unshakable vow to save his sister, then swung at Vitifnir with a desperate, all-or-nothing strike ruthless determination, driving every hit. Still reeling from that brutal fight, he stumbled into a huge gilded hall where the air crackled with the leftover heat of his own attack. His body shaking like the Imperial Wrath and Levitine were both hitting him at once. His scarred, weary hand clamped onto the ornate handle of that massive, heavy door, straining as he tried to force it open. As he fought the stubborn door, a massive presence slammed into the air behind him. He whipped around, eyes wide, only to spot a towering new figure stepping out of shimmering light. Right when she arrived, a stunning blonde with long, flowing hair and ornate armor stepped in, katana in hand. Because this wasn't just any stranger, she was the primordial Inbringer, Themingriva Albion, and she was going straight into action. Riva's voice stayed calm, but it hit like authority as she told Kyo she'd pretty much figured out what was going on. Then she leaned in and demanded to know if he was the one who'd triggered that intelligent entity. She stared him down, saying his DNA matched a man already confirmed dead, but he still talked like he wasn't Kaijuro Shimizu, and worse, he acted like he knew exactly what was coming next. so she leaned in and pressed him again, demanding the truth about who he really was. Meanwhile, in another corner of time, Kyo stood inside Yoichiro Shimizu's room at the Shimizu place. Right before Fumika burst in, he stared at his own reflection in the mirror, thinking about how everyone secretly wants to be the protagonist from games and novels. He confessed to himself that he'd once dreamed of a world like this too, just as a nobody friend or a background extra, not even the main character, and then reality hit. Way too brutal to swallow. He erupted in frustration, demanding to know why out of everyone it had to be Kyoichiro Shimizu, because this felt brutally unfair. Kyoichiro Shimizu got revealed as a character from the romance sim RPG Spirit Ward Dungeon Magia, aka the Damage series, showing up as the tutorial's classic mid-boss and boy. Everyone remembers how he always got completely and utterly annihilated. That cold truth of his new life crashed down on him no matter what he chose. He was doomed to die in every route because his world had already stamped his ending in stone. He kept wrestling with those wild, rapid-fire truths, even admitting he used to be a harmless nerd who obsessed over dating sims and trashy web novels until he woke up trapped as some doomed loser. And then he found Riva Albion staring right back, clocking that his insides really didn't match what she thought. Riva Albion stared him down and barked a ruthless warning. If his claims were real, he'd already have the perfect game plan to take down the trial intelligence. Then she snapped that unauthorized access had been detected, and the moment after that, his trial was locked in battle mode. No excuses. Everything spiraled so fast, it shoved him straight into back-to-back boss fights, with victory feeling impossible. Then the story zoomed into the wild, fan-favorite Japanese RPG world, the Dan Magi series starting with its classic opening, Spiritus Arms Battle Dungeon Magia. It follows Kyoichiro Shimizu, a mid-boss you meet in the tutorial, who somehow slams back into the scene the moment the protagonist steps into their first dungeon, forcing a fight. As he barks out the most bizarre cries, he keeps slamming the protagonist with status effects sleep, defense down gloating that his next attack will finish them, then barking that they should kneel to his spirit magic, and even after he traps and weakens them, Kyoichiro still flings out pathetic punches like a joke, ignores the weapon in his own hand, all while the rest of the party keeps beating him down. Every time he struck, the protagonist blocked him with ease, and he kept trying again and again to knock him out. But Kyoichiro just wouldn't break his pattern until the moment he finally got wiped out. Then, out of nowhere, the real boss showed up, a monstrous shadow entity, huge and terrifying, that swallowed Kyoichiro alive and cut his life short, ending his part in the main game for good. Nobody in the main game or in any official materials ever spelled out why Kyoichiro Shimizu went after the protagonist, so players just shrugged him off as a joke, a busted tutorial mid-boss. The crazy part is he later mused that if he got the chance to try again, he'd do it for fun. Hell, he'd even dance afterward, no matter what happened to him. In Great Spirit War, Dungeon Magia spirits ruled everything, and their power was so huge it shaped the whole world, split into 7 classes, with the apex called the Ultima class, and right before him stood Thimingriva Albion, an Ultima class spirit, the ultimate embodiment of the beginning and the primordial end, the undisputed strongest spirit in the original Dungeon Magia, so terrifying it was stronger than the final boss. She wasn't just a villain, she was the hidden final boss, the kind of threat that made every other character feel like background noise across the whole Dungeon Magia series, and the producer even admitted it. The Ultima spirits were still unfinished beings. They couldn't fully awaken until they found others like them. So once he saw that truth, there was only one move left. One choice. She loomed before him, blazing with overwhelming power, while he dropped to his knees and lifted his hands like a plea for mercy, swearing he didn't hold a shred of hostility and that she had nothing to fear from him, because he wasn't her enemy. He kept begging, spilling that he was nothing but a pathetic loser, so weak he couldn't even hurt a bug, and if a fight ever started, he'd get crushed on the very first move. So please, he begged her to spare him from any trial. He sank even lower, begging to do anything she demanded just to prove he was loyal to the goddess, straight up saying he'd lick her boots if it pleased her. She stayed stone cold, eyes faintly glowing, and swatted away his pleas like they were useless wrong, plain and simple. He scrambled to fix it, insisting he was just messing around, but she didn't even look back. She then declared the whole trial was pointless because his body already carried the mark of a chosen one, the bloodline of death, and he snapped his gaze up, totally lost, demanding to know what she meant by chosen and bloodline. Still totally stunned, he begged her to pause and spell out what chosen one even meant. Then she grimly judged his wording as a complete disaster and declared his intelligent entity utterly incomprehensible. She leaned in and told the chosen one the truth, special bloodline, special access, and only he could reach Ultima. Then she pointed out the DNA marks traces of death itself, and that's why her mind instantly locked onto him as the one qualified to claim it. He took it all in, a sly little smile tugging at his face as he praised the detailed answer, still feeling genuinely honored, even though he'd never known anything like this from all his years of gaming. Damaging. Right as he caught up with the implications, a fresh idea hit him like a brick. There could still be hidden settings and secret lore out there, and the biggest shock was learning that Kyuchera and Fumiko are siblings too. Meanwhile, a faint glow started spilling from her, waving a neon flag that something suspicious had been detected and pushing the whole confirm it check into action. Then she challenged him. Did he really know nothing about this world, especially after he managed to crash into her domain? She noticed that even after he grabbed a dagger, he was still itching to clash with her intelligent entity, which told her he must have got something worth trading for. Still on his knees before Thamengriva Albion, he threw out non-stop apologies, begging her to just hear him out. She accepted it, but laughed off the fancy talk, telling him to speak plainly, since his sharp intent already said everything, and less would say it better. Still sprawled on the ground, he scrambled to get his words back and asked if she meant even more casual, like just a simple thanks. She nodded and said, yeah. She wanted it even looser and more informal. He shot his eyes upward, confusion and grit wrestling on his face as he tried to make sense of her wild request to drop the formalities. She gave him a sharp nod, saying that this laid-back tone fit him like a glove. Then he rose, visibly flustered, but still agreed to her terms and braced himself to keep the negotiation going. With a fierce look on his face, he straight up demanded that Thamengriva Albion lend him her power to shield the Shimizu siblings. He refused to let them die, and he even threw in everything he knew about this world as the price. Then she cut in, asking what she'd truly get from signing a contract with him. He stared hard at Thamengriva Albion, sweat drenching his face, and forced himself to steady his breath before unleashing the crucial offer he couldn't hold back. He snapped his head just a little, eyes still locked forward, then started talking, ready to drop the real depth of what he knew. He told me he knew Ultima, the hidden boss, was stuck half-formed, and that facing another one of its kind would finish it. Then he bragged that after wiping the whole series clean, he already knew where every hidden boss spawns and exactly what triggers them. He wasn't pretending he knew it all, but he swore he had enough to make her wish come true. And right then, a shadowy monster lurked in the dark, watching like it was glued to his every word, pushing him to keep going. He stared at his own nightmare and realized these negotiations were worse than the Guardian battle. If they crumbled, he was finished. Still, he snapped that he didn't care what happened to him, not as long as his sister lived. Then he offered Thamengriva Albion his help to finish her work, only if his sister was safe. Kyoichiro Shimizu, trembling with desperation, slammed out that he'd pay any price just to meet the conditions for the Ultimas to awaken, then swore he'd hand over the crucial truth about the Ultima in exchange for power, like he'd just struck a deal with some shadowy presence whose glowing eyes cut through the dark. And yeah, he knew exactly what he was agreeing to. Meanwhile, a young, angelic presence rushed forward to report that the intelligent being had latched onto the situation with real interest, but even she couldn't shake a sharp mix of curiosity and doubt. Kyoichiro, still visibly shaken, blurted out that making his move like that had been a downright terrifying ordeal. He confessed that terror hit him so hard he thought he'd soil himself, but the angel-like being now fully revealed with a halo told him it was just a smell and nothing had actually formed. Then she snapped that a brand new problem was detected and asked if he had any questions, zeroing in on what the doubt status even meant. The angelic thing, now somehow dressed in a kitchen apron, pulled Kyoichiro aside and demanded he explain why he felt forced to save Shimizu Fumika, saying this whole dilemma came from the intelligent entity, and Kyoichiro swore stone cold that he would save her, Then she pounced on his logic, claiming because she's your little sister won't cut it, and warned that if his story is real, then he's nothing but a stranger wearing Kyoichiro's body. She pressed the point hard, saying there's no way his choices risking his own life to save Fumika could ever count as just instinct. Kyoichiro's eyes burned with resolve as he said the Shimizu Kyoichiro everyone knew was going to die. A fool's death soon. Then he grabbed 2 fingers up like, one for proof, and challenged you to ask if fate was truly set in stone, before laying out 3 possible outcomes. As his mind raced, a brutal truth hit him in Danmaji's main story. The Shimizu siblings were doomed to die in every route. But then he realized if he could somehow save even one of them, maybe he could rewrite his own fate too. Angel-like beings read the thoughts he never dared to say, and he couldn't shake the idea that if he saved one of them, it would somehow let him dodge his own death too. Kyoichiro nodded and made it clear this mission was exactly what he needed, and the payoff was undeniable. He blurted out his love for this world and swore that Damaji had flipped his entire life, no exaggeration, not even a little. He kept going, saying Damaji was his lifeline when life nearly crushed him, and calling it the best gal game ever made. Then his urge to stand up and act hit like a wave because Fumika was locked on a tragic ending with no escape. He even flashed back to losing his parents in his past life, and to the moment her homemade hamburger broke him into tears. Not just from gratitude, but because it felt like proof his reincarnation and meeting his favorite character meant something. He went on to explain what an otaku really is: someone utterly obsessed, spending wild money on game data and merch, even when the rest of the world calls it crazy, and he straight up challenged the idea that it's wrong to risk your life for a hobby, especially one tied to a character you love. The angel-like thing watched him closely, seeing how his simple devotion to Shimizu Fumika from his favorite series was so deep, he'd risk everything just for one homemade meal. Then this angelic being snapped at him, demanding to know why meddling in the world he loved and trying to reshape its future wasn't a direct contradiction, even an attack on the heart of everything he stood for. Her words hit hard and you could see him visibly shaken. He balled his fist and nodded. Yeah, she had a point, but then he made it crystal clear. Loving the game didn't mean he approved of every single thing about it. And the sharpest example was the one that still wrecked him, his sister Fumika's death, the gut punch that haunted him and made him wonder why she couldn't have been kept safe. And right then, he could feel it. Someone else carried the same hurt. Then he laid out his third and last reason and admitted the truth. His judgment wasn't just his. It was tangled up with whatever the original inhabitant still willed inside his body. He didn't know how much of Kyoichiro Shimizu remained in him, but he knew one thing. His burning urge to help his sister wasn't only his heart talking. He admitted that. At first, he shrugged off that angelic figure as some weak early game nobody, but now he knew he couldn't have gotten this far on luck or feelings alone. He finally pieced it together. The crushing voice inside him, the one that screamed, "I want to save my sister," was the same Kyoichiro's, the original Kyoichiro, and after being reborn as Shimizu Kyoichiro, he vowed to turn that shared wish into reality. With his spirit blazing again, he swore he'd never accept that cruel fate, then risked his life again and again, all for the one thing that mattered: saving Fumika. He dropped into a deep bow to that angelic presence, begged her to keep Fumika strong, and admitted the truth. Now they were 2 halves of the same Kiwitro, locked together by the same purpose. She answered his plea with a quick, "Roger," and right as she spoke, a glowing, ornate blade erupted into his hands, snapping him out of his shock. Then she told him his grit and will were finally proven enough. Once the pact was sealed, the entity dropped to one knee and told him, "I'm ready to work with you, master." And a chronicler's note made it official. This brainy thing now recognized him as a provisional contractor. Moments later, the story snapped to the Shimizu family's living room on March 26, 1989. Kyoichiro and the angel entities faced Fumika across the room, and you could see her trying to digest this brand new, terrifying reality. Fumika, still stunned, turned to Kyoichiro and demanded to know who the girl beside them was. Kyoichiro revealed she was Miss Himingliva Albion. Then the girl barged in fast, told them to call her Al, and left Fumika reeling when she insisted, "Call me elder sister." Yumika's face lit up with a delighted misunderstanding as she announced that Kaioichiro had finally brought home a girlfriend, swearing their parents in heaven would love it, while Kaioichiro panicked and desperately tried to set the record straight, insisting she had everything wrong. Meanwhile, Al stared at her plate and shrugged off the whole parents in heaven idea as pure nonsense. Then Kaioichiro snapped in frustration, calling her name. Still stunned from the last blow-up, Umika just stared in disbelief while Al kept eating, then asked her which was supposed to be real, the impossible concept he talked about, or the divine figure they worship at their shrine. Kaioichiro tried to clear the air, saying that it only sounds wrong because he and Al were stuck in a temporary master and slave kind of setup, yet Al just kept repeating, "Call me Al," like nothing else mattered. And when Fumika overheard it all, panic exploded in her face as she demanded answers, screaming that she'd never allow a relationship like that. Fumika's mind went straight to dirty fantasies, and she instantly shut them down with a hard no. But Kaioichiro panicked, trying to set the record straight that his body was still pure, then wheeled around to Al, who backed him up with a teasing, suggestive pose. Al kept eating with her mouth full, blurting apologies for her speech impediment while insisting they call her Al. Then she turned to Kaioichiro and asked very carefully if she could drink from his fluids, calling him Master, as she did. Fumika's face went hot with embarrassment and shock, and she clapped a hand over her mouth while Kaioichiro just stood there, drowning in the chaos of the misunderstandings spiraling out of control. She stood frozen, her thoughts spinning after the angel's blunt demand. Kaioichiro hurried in to calm her down, insisting it was just tea because it took him hours to finally talk his sister into believing him. We jump straight into the game's main story, zeroing in on Shimizu Fumika, Kaioichiro's sister, who sits in dead silence on a bunk bed, like something's about to snap. A heavy sadness clings to her face as the moment she's been driving toward finally breaks open, titled, "The Last Moment with You." She's not the heroine, she's the side character. The whole story is built around, tightly choreographed to track every twist of her relationship with the protagonist right up until she finally slips away in peace. No matter how hard anyone fights, her fate won't bend. She's the protagonist's beloved family member, and Kaioichiro just got slammed by a vicious, malevolent spirit. The protagonists scramble with everything they've got to save Fumika, but nothing works. This was always the curse's plan. She's marked as the sacrifice, her body swallowed by its power until she collapses into an unconscious, helpless silence. A tiny ornate key suddenly appears like fate itself, locked in place. The chronicler groans because now she can't even offer flowers to the gods anymore. Yumika looks shaken and stunned, then blurts out that if a secret meeting is happening, she has to be in it, because being left out makes her feel painfully alone. Owl stays eerily calm as he apologizes to Fumika, who's now chained up tight, and Kaioichiro quickly turns his face away like he can't handle it. Then Owl snaps back that this mess has nothing to do with them, and Fumika, eyes wide with shock, demands to know what kind of relationship they even have. Fumika, still tied up and visibly trembling, fires straight at Kaioichiro. Is Al's claim true? And before he can even answer, Al cuts in and declares Kaioichiro is her benefactor, the one who handed her those memories and the will to live, leaving Kaioichiro staring in total shock. She snapped awake, feeling totally lost, couldn't place where she was, not even who she was. Then a giant shadow loomed over her like it meant to swallow her whole. Right when despair started to take over, Kaioichiro, a young man, showed up and pressed a piece of bread into her hands. Pure hope in the middle of the dark. Their tiny breath of relief was ripped away when a pack of ruthless thugs stormed in, closing the circle fast to grab her. Kaioichiro, outmatched and still fearless, dug in his heels and roared back, daring them to come closer. Kaioichiro fought like a storm, but the sheer horde of thugs crushed him in an instant, battering him into a bloody mess, and she stood there, frozen, watching her benefactor get brutalized as rage finally ripped through her. And somehow, even after Kaioichiro got crushed, he dug up a secret strength from the wreckage. Then he unleashed an unknown power and knocked the thugs out in seconds. He'd saved her, sure, but he was left bruised and battered, and all the details blurred fast. The thugs' names were a complete haze. The only thing he could clearly remember was that a young guy named Sugio came to save him. Back in the present, Fumika's eyes shimmered with tears as she broke down over everything Al had just spilled, and then she snapped that she'd take Al under her own roof, leaving Kaioichiro to stop worrying. Kaioichiro leaned against Al and said her trust felt like a gift, but her constant worrying was starting to get under his skin. Then Al looked at him, called him master, and pleaded with him not to stress. As they stood side by side, she finally spilled the truth behind their bond. Kaioichiro wasn't just connected to her, the one who got sacrificed. It all traced back to an ancient pact and a bloodline tie older than anything they'd ever understood. She pressed on, saying every word was a divine decree for all of them. Kaioichiro, still reeling from the shock, could only blurt out a stunned, "Wait!" I'll say it plain, she'd listen to every request he made and believe every word he spoke, and she carried an absolute, no-strings love for him. Kaioichiro blinked, stunned by how hard she meant it, and Fumika, watching them, urged them to go back to their private talk. Al kept a calm smile on her face and reassured Kaioichiro, telling him not to worry. She promised she wasn't out to hurt his home. Still sprawled on the floor, Al locked in. She swore she'd never waver in her loyalty to Kaioichiro, and if he kept his word, she'd serve him like a faithful servant. Then the fear flickered through her mind. What if she'd accidentally set a wild god loose? She shoved that thought aside fast and stared straight at the here and now, while the cat-eared woman and Fumika watched her like they couldn't blink. Then she leaned in and told Kaioichiro the truth. She had a mysterious power no one could explain, and while he stood there with the cat-eared woman and Fumika, curiosity and worry tangled in his chest. He replayed the night with those thugs in his head and realized it was her power that shoved them back for good. Then he noticed one more thing. Somehow she'd walked out of the chaos, completely unhurt, like she could heal. He still remembered Al showing up with her clothes ripped to shreds, yet somehow she wasn't badly hurt, and the cat-eared woman watching them quietly clocked it. Those thugs weren't as harmless as they'd tried to look. He replayed her return in his mind, clocking just how stubborn and sharp she was, especially the way she knew the game inside out. Then he pivoted to Fumika and warned her that sure, their wish might come true, but she'd been pushing herself way too hard lately. Fumika, stunned by his worry, blurted out if he was scared for her. Then he nodded, coaxed her to shut her eyes, and right as that moment hit, Al dropped the truth she was Hemingway Albion, a god beyond time and space, trapped only because time itself was holding her down. As Al finally spilled her real form and the boundaries of her power, Kaioichiro snapped that he was going to use it to shove Fumika back to who she was before the curse, fully banking on his game knowledge and the pact they shared, and he begged Al to make it happen. With her eyes shut, Fumika hovered in the middle of several tiny, childlike copies of herself, all crying out that she was their sister, their only family. Kaioichiro, choked with emotion, dropped his head to the ground, begging the divine power with his whole heart, swearing he'd give anything back. Fumika kept her eyes shut, and one tear finally spilled free, while the cat-eared woman stared with a face you couldn't read. Kaioichiro didn't stop. He kept begging, fighting for his family's safety, like his life depended on it. Fumika snapped her eyes open, feeling weightless and brand new, and the air tasted insanely good. Kaioichiro exhaled in relief, because they actually pulled it off. Then he told her they dodged a brutal fate, a demon's curse, by slipping through a loophole, and Fumika clung to him, squeezing him tight with nothing but pure gratitude on her face. After the brutal ordeal, Kaioichiro collapsed onto his bed, drained and mumbling about how wiped out he felt. Then a gentle knock hit the door, and a voice called out, "Master!" The cat-eared woman stood in the doorway with her phone in hand, catching Fumika as she brushed her teeth in the back, and gently wagging a finger, reminding her that if someone gets saved, they've got to properly greet the person who helped them. After her recovery, they threw a small feast to celebrate, and Fumika, fully back to herself, devoured food like it owed her money, gobbling up nearly half the spread all by herself. Kaioichiro just stared and laughed, saying she really was a true Shimizu. Soon, Kaioichiro poured out his heartfelt thanks to Al for saving the day, and she smiled back, telling him it was finally his turn to keep his promise right where their pact was leading. But a massive problem slammed down on the horizon, closing in fast and getting impossible to ignore. I'll tell you this, Kaioichiro's skills as a master smash, what an average otherworld person could ever do. And she pushes him to renegotiate their contract, lock him in as a real cooperative partner, not just some lucky benefactor. If they don't, she makes it clear their current deal will get torn up. She pressed on, saying the only way he could dodge the death waiting for them was simple. She had to become his new contract and make him her master. Once that deal was signed, it would lock Kyoichiro and Fumika into the same fate. With a cold, ruthless look in her eyes, she snapped, "I didn't save you." Kyoichiro, who'd been staring at the screen, snapped his head around in total confusion, glaring at her like, "Wait, did you just say that?" She leaned in and pressed the woman for answers. What did she mean by Gleva Albion not saving them? And why was she insisting she hadn't saved either of them? He gaped at Al, eyes blazing with disbelief as those words finally hit him like a truck. "Yeah," he muttered, still shaking from the shock of it all. She kept going, saying her contract with him and Fumika still stands. No loopholes, no excuses. Then she snapped, "And call me ol." He just stared, utterly lost. Wait a minute. He pinned her down and demanded answers. If Al didn't truly save them, how did Fumika recover? Al stayed calm and said she really had broken the curse, hurting his sister. Then he snapped, rage flaring. "So you're saying you just stopped it?" Kyoichiro, someone who knows this world inside out, should get it immediately. And she just sat back casually, watching his reaction, like she already knew what he'd do. She leaned in and spilled the truth. Her power didn't just bend time, it rewrote the very rules of cause and effect. He crumpled forward, and his mind wouldn't stop spinning. If her power could rewind time, why couldn't she undo every single thing for real? Was it actually impossible for her? He finally cracked the truth. The real trouble was his master status, and it instantly sparked a brand new problem. He shot a confused look upward and demanded, "Spirit level." Then he watched him. She kept her expression locked tight, unreadable. A brand new narrator burst in and spilled the secrets of Dungeon Magia Spirit War. This time, the heroes aren't humans at all. They're spirits, and their human contractors yank on that power to chase their own goals. Then boom, two figures appear, a male spirit and a female spirit, each embodying the whole idea in one glance. The narration dove into the guts of spirit level, explaining how, in the actual game, contractors scored points, leveled up their spirits, and then poured those points in to unleash what was already inside power that triggered status fixes, unlocked rare exclusive skills, and brought the spirit's blessings too. All of it, stacked together, was called spirit level, the core fuel of growth. He demanded to know whether his contract had already been released, and Al told him, "Yeah, it's out," but warned that his time-stop skill was basically useless right now because of how he's currently holding up. She then shrugged that releasing the contract was no problem at all for her. In that patterned room, she stood her ground and kept breaking down exactly how her time-stop power worked. He clutched his head in despair, cursing his own naivete, while Al stepped in and said the only way to fully unlock the skill and use its real, practical functions was to rack up a massive chunk of experience points. Al snapped her mask off and revealed her real power, hemming Gleva Albion, then basically said she could bend time and rewrite cause and effect with zero effort. But Kyoichiro, her contractor, couldn't use it that far. She also made it crystal clear that just like her, his spirit, the game system, and its pull were all here in this world. She said it didn't matter what they tried because the curse would cling on no matter what. Staring straight at Kyoichiro, she leaned in and said the interference from the third dimension only kicks in when she's tied to her contractor. Kyoichiro's face twisted with pure horror as he blurted, "Wait, if the master dies somewhere, does my sister's curse get slapped right back onto her?" Then he snapped, "And if I die, does her curse return too?" Right in the middle of all that panic, the cat-eared woman just kept chewing like none of it mattered. He brushed the idea off like a cruel prank. No way, not that kind of wait. Then panic crept in. If he wanted to survive this tutorial and not end up as a pathetic mid-boss, he'd have to stay far from the game's main character and somehow keep himself alive. In the end, he had to face the truth. There was no path through this. He got why the attack hit the protagonist and his friends, because one of his own companions was the one cursed. Then he snapped that if power was needed, he'd borrow it. And finally he revealed the real reason behind that earlier rampage was something totally different. This brutal, malicious phenomenon hit alongside the curse. Everyone called it the Mark of the Innocent. And once it showed up, it forced him down a road soaked in death and destruction. He stared at the thought of his sister, Fumika, and it hit him hard if he stayed weak. He'd never rip out the true cause of her death, and she'd keep living that safe, normal life, blissfully unaware that danger was still waiting. I already told you, his weakness meant that if he tried to take down a mid-boss, the kill would slam him into a contract that could wipe his family out. He snapped his head to Al, desperation carving lines into his face as he demanded to know what he weak, powerless him was even supposed to do. Then he hammered at her for the price of reversing time, undoing every disaster that brought them here, and Al finally answered a rough estimate, said he'd have to crush at least 7 high-level demigods, or gut-powerful dungeon bosses. He flinched at how impossible it was, snapping that he couldn't pull it off at his current level, even knowing everything he knew so far. Alcon Kurd swallowed the fear, clenched his fists with grit, and vowed to press on step by step, using the rules of this world like a map. Then he started thinking about the world's strange powers, places packed with cures so total they could heal any wound or illness, like a panacea or even a wish-granting vessel. He knew he'd have to grab things like that sooner or later, but right now, the only road open to him was diving into the dungeons. Standing in that room, he leaned toward Al and said, "No Adventurer's Guild card means no dungeon access." Al stayed calm and replied, "I've been stuck like this since I first woke up." He stared at her, stunned by the truth. He choked on frustration and snapped that if he stayed weak, he'd die for sure, then there'd be no way to save his sister and Al. With a hard look in his eyes, fired back with one answer, "Get stronger." Next day, he strode through the city streets, still buzzing from yesterday's brutal talk about the eternal loop strategy, until it hit him. He'd been so locked onto the info that he never really looked up to see the world around him. He spun around, and the cityscape hit him like a punch, same layout as his world. But the people were totally different, all kinds of beings walking around like nothing was wrong. Then it all clicked. He wasn't dreaming anymore. He'd really landed in the world of Damachi, and right when he locked in, his eyes caught a familiar sight, the cat ear woman strolling nearby. He stopped outside the barber shop, stared up at the sky, and a gut punch of realization hit him hard. This was real, the world he loved, and he couldn't stop thinking maybe this is exactly where he was meant to be. He finally stumbled in late, and there they all were, waiting for him. She stood with her arms crossed, brow pinched, and snapped at his tardiness, calling him master, while she recoiled like he'd kept her waiting on purpose. His focus wasn't just on Al. Then he blurted out in shock, demanding to know who that unseen person was. He kept going, telling her he was done fooling around. He was determined to become a more serious version of himself and carve out a slightly better future. And when he confessed he'd originally mistaken Al for an uninvited guest, her face snapped into shock. The producer of Spirit Beast, Great War Dungeon Magia, right in the third game said he built the fights and enemy crews to hit hard, but still make sense, because if the game felt too easy, players would feel flat-out cheated. They shut that down and spilled the real deal. The series runs on turn-based battles, where every enemy follows a pre-written move pattern. Early tutorial bosses were easy, but as you went deeper, those patterns started braiding together until enemies hit you with dizzying, wildly different combos. Even with all that fancy design, the bear-like gamer shot up in rage and shouted that the bosses were completely unfair because not knowing their next move meant instant defeat. Again and again, until despair chained him in place. Then the words "Game Over" popped on his handheld, and he clenched his resolve and said, "Try again." Then the story spins into Rebuild World, where a brutal back-alley warrior boss steps out. She's terrifyingly high level, a female force of nature with a special power that lets her launch multiple attacks at once, turning the battlefield into her almost immortal playground. This shadowy boss, yanked tight in chains, was said to be immortal, able to snuff out a player's moves and drain them by a full 100, and with 9 brutal attacks. She was pure nightmare fuel, proof the game wasn't here to let you breathe. Moments later, Kyoichiro and Al were posted outside the school building when he hurried up to an older teacher. "Armi, I'm Garish," threw out a quick apology and said he hoped he hadn't caused any trouble. Then the teacher's face tightened, noticing how much thinner Kyoichiro looked and pressing him to tell the truth. Was he really okay? The teacher leaned in and asked if he really was Shimizu Ichiro, the second-year middle schooler. Kyoichiro shot back that yes, it was him, and said he was 14. Then he couldn't help but think about how much he'd grown in just a few months since he started training with Al. She said blessings don't just help, they explode alongside natural talent, and that's why the power gap is huge. Then she turned to her master and demanded he get it. Before dropping a jaw-shattering truth, the idea that a day ends after 24 hours is a lie, because her domain grips time and even the chain of cause and effect itself. Her control over time and causality let one single day inside her territory stretch into 3, 4, and sometimes even an entire week, like reality itself was bending, and that was the jaw-dropping revelation. Kaiōichiro was still stunned by her confession, staring at her with eyes stretched wide in pure disbelief. She told him the time she spent healing and rebuilding herself had aged her, and she begged him to just call her Al. But he couldn't see past it, because all he could think was that she was a malevolent force, an absolute evil god. She leaned in and said, "From this day on, she'll start your spirit arts training, because spirit arts is how you tap the spirit world through your spirit vein and use that bond." Then she broke it down. You need power, astral power, or AP like the game calls it. And her training had 2 missions: boost your AP recovery rate and grow your AP capacity. She went on to explain it like this: humans don't come with an AP container. They can just pull from, so they make contracts with spirits, and those spirits feed them the AP, which they later burn up when they use spirit arts. Without a single warning, she exploded forward and smashed a brutal kick into Kaiōichiro, sending a rush of spirit power surging through him, and he went flying, hitting the ground in a heap. As he crumpled on the ground, stunned and breathless, she leaned in and declared that she'd keep pouring spirit power into him over and over until his reserves hit 0. Like she was grinding him through a brutal loop of pain and recovery, shaping him the way you forge steel, and in that moment, all he could see was a demon. She kept talking, saying training was like forging a body, and spirit arts like transforming or boosting resistance could grow to crazy levels. But if his own body ever got split away from what he felt, the effects of resistance and enhancement started to fade, and that's when his brain started screaming, like his mind was being ripped in two. Then she fired off a question: could a physically built vanguard also act like a shield, or was it a total one-hit joke? And with zero hesitation, she slammed the truth down. A spirit user or a priest absolutely could not be a vanguard. Kaiōichiro still looked totally wrecked, but he nodded along with her verdict. Then he grumbled that solo dungeon crawling was pure desperation, and even with someone beside him, it still felt like some unseen boss was standing over his shoulder, barking orders. Then it hit him. His world was packed with otaku who matched his tastes, so he decided he'd need the perfect crew: a recovery type, a long-range attacker, and a close-range brawler. Ideally 1 person per role, so his run with Al could flow smoothly. He was sprawled in the snow, completely wiped out, while Al, totally unbothered, just crunched on an apple she asked how he felt, then cut him down with the truth his training wasn't even enough to survive 1 single hit from her. Al snapped, "Wake up!" And it lit a fresh fire in him. He shot upright with a hard stare, vowed he'd prove what he could really do, and clutched a massive wooden sword. He slammed that colossal wooden sword down with fresh power, proving the arm reinforcement spirit art instantly bulged his chest and pumped up his arm muscles. Then Al nodded like, "Yep, that's a basic skill you learn way back in training." He tore across the snowy wasteland like a streak of lightning, shredding the snow behind him, and Al clocked it instantly. This wasn't just speed, it was time acceleration. She told him time acceleration wasn't some trick. It was a rare, built-in gift that let him crank time inside his own body. So every 1 second the world lived, his body tore through it 60 times over, carving out real minutes from a single heartbeat. He swung that wooden sword like it meant something, but she slid out of the way with 0 effort, saying it might have landed if she hadn't dodged. Then he kept hammering forward, each quick strike blasting snowy plumes into the air. He studied her, sure he finally had her trapped, then lunged with everything he had, arm outstretched as he shot to grab her. She slipped from his grasp in seconds, smooth, sharp, untouchable, then shrugged and said he was way too naive, and his wild missed lunge blasted him flying backward through the air. He slammed into the snow, carving a brutal dent, and snapped in pure frustration. Then he shouted that she was a beast for how relentlessly good she was. Still seething, he muttered that he couldn't believe she slipped away from him, especially after he'd charged her from behind, while Al lingered in the distance, watching every move. As he listened, Al kept talking, saying his body had grown a ton, and that his current master, the musclehead herself, was pushing him hard. She admitted spirit arts were tricky and building spiritual power drained a ridiculous amount of energy. Then she hit him with the details: arm reinforcement, leg reinforcement, and even time acceleration, useful but exhausting. And right when it sounded like she was done, she dropped the real threat, Levitine, a hidden counterattack. She then fired the question at him. Was he planning to raise it or drop it? And you could feel the trap in her tone. Al praised how wild her growth as a master was, then flipped it back on her. Was he really trying to stop her, or was he about to unleash Levitine on her? Al stayed stone-faced, still clutching her food, while he replayed her words in his head, because if he didn't believe in himself, he'd stay weak and breakable, and he couldn't stop wondering if she really thought he had no talent at all, just that she was pushing him harder. Then she leaned in, gently reassured him that self-doubt was only natural, and when he dropped to his knees, he quietly thanked her. So I told him straight up he was still immature, then demanded he lean on her. One more time he stared at me, shocked, because he'd always thought his master was a total perfectionist. Later, he was spotted trudging off, stuck on Al's words, trying to figure out if she was really as scatterbrained as everyone says. With a soft smile, Humika finally understood Kai Oichiro had been grinding himself into an adventurer just to make her life better, and she swore she'd stand by him no matter what. She cupped his face and begged him to promise he'd come back safe. Then he answered with a quiet, steady nod. Even as Kaio Ichiro got ready to leave, her worry was still burning in his thoughts, so he leaned in and promised he'd come back safe. Al, always watching, snapped back that she'd take care of everything on her side. Then Kaio Ichiro flashed a confident grin, told them goodbye, and set off like he meant it. Kaio Ichiro saw the dungeon world as his battleground and his spotlight, a dream stage where adventurers chased glory, and where every treasure and monster could swing wildly depending on what kind of dungeon it was to him. The real heart of dungeon diving was the spirit stones, the ultimate power source. As Kaio Ichiro strode through the city, he couldn't stop thinking about spirit stones, how they could turn into any kind of energy, burn way more efficiently than fossil fuels, and leave the environment nearly untouched, making them the unbeatable power source. Kaio Ichiro stared at the world's weird rules. Everyone's fate really was being steered by spiritual power, and it hit him. This was the dungeon world, where the right adventurers were needed to make it work. Then he charged through a doorway and stepped into a huge, grand building. He stormed into Dungeon City Securica Dungeon number 27, the Moon Cocoon, and a glowing digital sign snapped the truth. Today's adventurer qualification exam would be on the 15th floor. Al drifted beside him and said it had been forever since she'd seen a god or a shrine maiden. As the elevator shot upward, Kaiochiro caught Al's voice asking, "Did you call me?" He blurted, "No," then realized she was speaking straight into his mind. She told him that while they were apart, nobody could overhear it because this telepathic chat was a contractor, only perk for them and their spirits. I'll spell it out as Hemmingleva Albion. She can't just step straight into the dungeon because the other world's rule of inviolability stops spirit beings from fully manifesting in the physical realm. Kaio Ichiro leaned in, locked onto every word because that's exactly why the dungeon god, Ultima, stood as one of the rule's pillars. He finally barreled into the exam reception area, slid up to the desk, and snapped, "Kaio Ichiro Shimizu, exam number 267, then gave a respectful nod as he said, "I'm ready. I look forward to working with you today." He faced the registration desk, clutching papers that proved he was Shimizu Kaiochiro, number 26, then watched the receptionist scan his form and gasp when she saw he claimed he was 15 and enrolled at Sakuraka Second Middle School, and he backed up every single detail as his sudden presence yanked everyone's eyes his way. Adventurers camped nearby. They grilled him about his age, stunned that someone with his massive build could still be in middle school, and even teased his outfit, saying it looked like it was stamped with an old man's face. The crowd's whispers hit him like a spark. His cheeks flared red and his face went crimson in seconds. He realized with a jolt that he looked so out of place it felt like he'd wandered in from another species, and he couldn't help wondering if the surge of anger coursing through him was what set him off. Stunned by all the eyes on him, he tried to bolt, but the tall adventurer beside him snapped onto his arm and stopped him cold. Watching the whole thing unfold, the receptionist clocked his shyness and the way crowds clearly made him uneasy. He steadied himself and blurted that he had to crush this exam right now to become an adventurer. But that wasn't the whole story, because he was clearly aiming for something deeper, something specific. And this exam was the key. The second he stopped, seriousness hit his face hard. Then Al's faint voice echoed in his head, snapping him back to what he'd said earlier about being 15. She gave a soft, uncertain smile and stared at their ages, asking herself if they were the same, or if she was really just a year older because her face absolutely didn't look like it. Meanwhile, this brand new, bright-eyed female adventurer beamed with pure excitement, loved seeing all these hopeful adventurers lining up for the exam, and right then, her gaze snapped to someone. His eyes snapped wide with instant recognition, and shock jolted straight through his whole body. He snapped out a shocked exclamation as she spun around, their eyes locking. Then she blurted that maybe he was someone she'd met before, while other adventurers nearby leaned in, surprised a girl was standing among the applicants. She stood like a wall, eyes locked forward, even as a Rakshasa menace, one of the most terrifying bosses, materialized out of nowhere and loomed right behind her. Meanwhile, Kyoichiro wore a grim face, eyes locked on what was coming, feeling destiny waiting for him just ahead on this same road. His racing thoughts snapped into focus the moment he found himself staring down Aoba, a young woman whose own cruel fate had already started moving. Kyoichiro Shimizu hoisted Al on his back and strode down the city street, and the chronicler marked the day as the 1189th imperial year, right in the middle of a training stretch. They were headed home with weights still strapped on. Al snapped, "If you want to beat that boss like she told you, then you've got to drill both attack and defense sword moves, no shortcuts." She shot him a question. "Do you have anyone in mind for a master?" And he started weighing whether he should reach out to the original game's heroes. I'd question whether heroines are really promised a certain level of strength. When I asked, his face tightened and trouble flashed in his eyes. He kept carrying her, wrestling with the fact that, yeah, he could spot a few possible allies from his game instincts, but the rules for turning anyone into a real teammate were brutally strict. He hurried past the crosswalk, already grimacing at the thought that recruiting a sword-wielding heroine for his party and actually getting along with her was going to take serious effort. I'll admit it, he didn't want to steal the game's destiny from the protagonist and heroine, and when she said it, he nodded hard and said, "Yeah, I'm just Al." He suddenly burst out shouting that he was a gouge player, then laid it all bare he wanted to wrench his sister and his own rotten fate into something better. But he wasn't trying to swap out the game's hero. He just wanted to see the hero and the heroine finally happy together. I could feel the heat of his obsession. She saw it clearly. He hadn't surrendered his goal for even a second. He said they should grab allies if they can, but he also had to weigh the master's wishes. And in the end, he decided it was totally fine, as long as the recruits weren't the protagonist or the heroine. He told her that if she was the sword type, she'd need a secret web of family and trusted acquaintances, and the dark-haired girl leaned in, hanging on every word. He pressed on, saying that once he spotted the right candidates, he'd dig into every link in their past, because that's how you collect iron souls. The exact way his master taught him. Al walked ahead, listening. Moments later, he slung Al over his shoulder and pushed through the roaring city streets, telling her he'd finally found a candidate. Then Al's eyes widened as she blurted out, "Wait, is it family?" As they kept going, Aoba the cat-eared woman watched them from afar, clocking just how close they seemed. He stared at the date, Imperial Year 1190, April 1st, standing at the 27th Dungeon Portal Gate in Sakuragi City, and his mind instantly snapped to his sister, Fumika, one of the Dungeon Master game's heroines, because he finally understood the license rule he had to switch his name to Haruka, and the real game would kick off in just 2 years. He leans in and tells Aoba straight up, this trial's events don't stay here. They slam into the main story and wreck everything. He kept talking to Aoba, swearing he'd always felt his sister would show up, and then admitted he was shocked to see her like this, because it was the first time he'd ever seen her in such a state, while Aoba just listened, then let out a confused little questioning sound. His focus snapped to something. There was Fumika, right in that packed crowd, slipping away from him, and before he could even think, he blurted her name, stunned out of his mind. Then he leaned in and told Al the portal gate was the real deal one that could yank them straight into another dimension in an instant, linking the real world to something else entirely. Al listened, locked in as the mystery unfolded. A towering, high-ceiling hall stretched out above them, etched with wild, circuit-like patterns, and the whole place thrummed with the low murmur of a massive crowd, adventurers packed in tight, all staring ahead like something big was about to happen. Kyoichiro stared at the portal gate. Sure, it looked like a teleport wheel, but in reality, it was just a plain door. And as he talked, a female official stepped up and her voice cut through the whole hall. She, the official, kicked off the trial by laying out the goal in plain terms. Everyone would dive into the main dungeon through the portal gate, hunt, fight, and rack up points as they went, all within a tight 90-minute countdown. Then she made it clear there were two big ways to earn those points. The official explained that one way was to crush monsters inside the dungeon and grab spirit stones, though their worth and number could swing wildly, then cash them in for points. And she warned, teeth bared, that trading spirit stones under the table was absolutely outlawed and would get you kicked out on the spot. Her face turned stone cold as she blurted one last, no-nonsense warning. Don't you dare entertain any weird, forbidden ideas. A packed crowd leaned in, their eyes locked on the officials up front as they devoured every word of the trial's rules. Kyoichiro watched the whole event unfold and realized the punishments for breaking the rules were shockingly light. Then he remembered a master who'd smuggled in a levitine during an earlier trial, and he couldn't ignore how wild that was, because the rules for leveling up combat power always felt blurry at best. The official broke down the points rules. Grab all 100 points yourself, and you take the full reward pair up with someone, and those same 100 points get split evenly, 50 each, and the total evaluation points shift, depending on how many people are working together. She went on to say that solo hunting might rake in more points, but it also eats way more effort. Then she switched to the second points method, warning that it's way harder because you've got so many other participants in the mix. With a male colleague stepping in beside her, she wrapped up the talk and made it crystal clear this trial was all about whether you could fight for real. Then she fired off a final warning. Don't even think about breaking dungeon rules. And if you're brave enough, step up and test yourself. Once the main explanation was done, she told everyone with questions to ask right now before time ran out. She nodded to his questions and said that the second point he raised was all about how the operations team's alert status should be handled during the real trial, and then she urged him to break it down clearly, within reason. She said the trial was built for the first floor only, all for safety since they could easily bring everyone back, and she'd team up with her subordinate to supervise the whole thing. As she spoke, a male official slid in beside her, watching her like a supervisor, and he even had a full map of the first 24 floors good for 24 hours, but Kyoichiro looked shaken by her harsh stare, and Aoba, the cat-eared woman, wore the same worried expression. Kyoichiro then demanded answers about the Ring of Transference, the thing that could instantly yank you between worlds. And sure, he knew it was a one-time item, but why wasn't it set up for this trial? She told him it wasn't handed out at all, meaning it was way too precious. Then he leaned in and asked if his guess was right. Oba, overhearing everything, couldn't shake the thought that Kyoichiro was fixated on the blood-stained Rakshasa, so Kyoichiro finally confessed he was uneasy, warning that if the Rakshasa showed up on the first floor, it'd be a disaster, because with the way things stood, too many lives would get buried in the trial, and already, 2 brave souls were dead. He told himself that even if he pushed for more security, it would still be pointless. Meanwhile, Al sat there, munching beside the cat-eared woman as she listened. Al broke down how the master's memories were shattered. So badly all you got was a 2-word summary. She sighed, saying there was nobody worth mourning or hating the world for, just someone stuck doing nothing. Then the cat-eared woman shrugged and said, "If that's all it is, then fine, we'll just give it our best shot." At the trial, the female receptionist snapped, "The portal gate is opening." Everyone rushed to the entrance on the first floor, and the moment everyone waited for was here. The trial was about to begin. Right before they stepped in, they were ordered to apply for their weapons and grab them from the container. Kyoichiro, now gripping a huge, heavy sword, staggered under the sheer weight of it, and all he could think was, what's coming next? He clutched that massive sword, and the weight kept daring him, but his resolve only burned brighter, because he'd clear this dungeon no matter what smashed in his way. He stood right in front of the grand entrance to Sakura City's dungeon, the Moon's Embrace, staring back at the 1 year since he'd arrived in this world, and finally, the lock on the main content was about to break. He stepped forward, declared his presence, and geared up to storm whatever waited inside. He bragged that he cleared the first dungeon in record time, but that stern female official shot him a warning look and shut his arrogance down. There are too many eyes on him, so he'd better slow down, play it smart, and use his time wisely. The official stepped up, declared the adventurer's trial officially underway, and slammed down a hard 90-minute timer. Then she told everyone to throw everything they had at it, because there'd be no second chances, before finally barking the order to begin. He snapped to attention, readying himself to charge straight into the unknown. The moment the trial kicked off for real, the other adventurers charged ahead and vanished into that shimmering portal. Then Aoba glided after them with jaw-dropping speed, a confident grin on her lips as she disappeared into the dungeon too. Still wrestling with the brutal weight of his sword, he stared as Aoba vanished in a blur, shocked at how agile she was and how effortless it looked as she slipped into the portal. Moments later, Aoba turned inside the dungeon's shimmering depths and shouted back to him, her voice roaring through the air. She flashed a bright smile at him, like her eyes were yelling, "Hurry up, get over here." He stayed planted at the entrance, staring at her, and a sharp, wry realization hit him. He was getting completely smothered. He couldn't stop replaying Aoba's earlier words. Did his look make him seem like he was begging for help, or did she clock his skills right away? And while he spiraled in his thoughts, Aoba kept watching him like she already knew the answer. Her next taunt ripped through his thoughts. She accused him of being a creepy stalker and a bastard, and even though he recognized the teasing pattern, it still hit way too close. The moment he finally stepped into the dungeon's sparkling crystal depths, Aoba's voice rang out from deeper in, asking if he really planned to die a normal death and demanding whether he'd finally stop chasing her. He brushed her off and snapped his attention straight to the dungeon, because even though everyone called it a beginner's trial, his master had warned him the truth was way worse. This place could crank up fear and rage in an instant, until minds cracked and people fell apart. Aoba stayed in the lead, then snapped to the thought, did his master's kindness even exist? Or was he just dreaming? She told him not to get his hopes too high. Then boom! Kyoichiro and Aoba both snapped into silence, their jokes dying instantly as an unexpected shock hit them. Tiny, insect-like shadows burst into the air around them, and Aoba snapped into motion, leaping away in a blink, while Kyoichiro got stuck staring down the swarm forming in front of him. He clenched his teeth and swore he'd catch up to her, no matter what. As Aoba kept sprinting forward and glanced back with that smug little smirk, Kyoichiro's gut dropped. He finally got the whole picture. The shadowy enemies were real. And there were 5 of them. He spat out a curse, whining that this was the absolute worst possible timing, especially with customers like these hanging around. Down in the dungeons, bizarre essences crawl out, and the moment the player logs in, they carve out a whole avatar body inside that cramped world, the tiny round creature you see, while the human figure is really the player's true self, separate and untouchable. Even when they get beaten, these essences don't die on the spot. They move right into something else, like they're feeding on the moment. And the tiny avatar, lost in thought, clutches a book. In the real world, this kind of consume costs you months of salary, and the stronger the essence gets, the more spirit stones it guzzles, basically setting a whole system in motion to farm them. The avatar grips a tiny bag, staring at the price tag like it might bite. A player, clearly shaken, hears that the dungeon's managers skim a brutal chunk, basically half a level's worth of pain, and the system is built to feed that back to the managers, while the avatar just stares, wide-eyed, realizing the whole nightmare is real. With every implication sinking in, the avatar finally grasps the truth. Essences don't exist by accident. They're tied to one specific race, and that bombshell only makes the mystery darker. Essences don't show up in dungeons just to be harvested. They're there to level themselves up. And that clashes hard with what humans want, because they dive in chasing resources and loot. After the avatar realizes the real purpose, it levels faster, locks in on the one true goal, climb to the top, ascend into a higher dimension, and make that higher self journey the supreme joy, no question, no compromise. Essences are terrifyingly powerful beings everyone already knows about, and they don't need outsiders to prove what they're worth. This is literally how they're made. At the same time, a determined swordsman locks in, ready to strike, and then boom, a mysterious woman with her face hidden is revealed. The narrator makes it clear, essences aren't just strong, they come from an unshakable, built-in, higher tier background. that never changes. In the middle of a brutal fight, the swordsman slammed his blade into the stone floor, blasting out ripples as shadowy, shapeless figures oozed into view around him, ready to clash. The shadowy figures snapped into focus, revealing a grotesque goblin and a snarling cobalt beast. He looked around and realized a vicious horde of grotesque goblins and agile kobolds had him boxed in crude blades in one hand, bows in the other, and their numbers absolutely crushed his. He raised his hand and slammed an advanced skill into the air, glowing runes blazing over his palm, thinking, "These monsters are nothing but experience waiting to be farmed," then realizing they wouldn't let him through anyway, because they were just tasty prey. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked on his leg strength boost and suddenly felt light on his feet. Moving like lightning, one clean hit could kill him, and escape was basically off the table. But he refused to back down as he zeroed in on the mystery he had to get past just one step closer. His thoughts flickered back to that mysterious woman, the one who warned him that once you're trapped in a dungeon, there's no real escape, so he nodded once, sharp and sure. And then he roared like a battle god as he charged straight into the chaos. He tore through the chaos at breakneck speed, zipping past the kobold's arrows and slipping through the goblin's clumsy blade swings like it was nothing, weaving one sharp dodge into the next. With a savage parry, he snapped away a cobalt strike, then swung his greatsword in a blur, cutting the goblin clean in half as it fizzled into glittering light, dropping a tiny glowing spirit stone behind. More goblins shrieked and lunged at him, but he was already gone. Only afterimages stayed behind. Then he whipped in another brutal strike, and a second goblin exploded into light, stacking the spirit stones higher with every hit. He stood amid the ruins of his enemies, the ground strewn with dying goblin and cobalt bodies, proof that his power crushed them all. As he crouched to grab the freshly formed spirit stone, a tiny white, blob-like creature with huge eyes popped into his hand and asked if he was its master, and he just smirked. Sure, these enemies were weak, but they were the perfect warm-up, so he told himself not to hesitate before crushing them. Now that the spirit avatar was at his side, he pushed deeper into the dungeon with iron resolve, and once again, the mysterious woman lit a fire in his chest as he vowed he'd finally catch up to her. That little chibi spirit avatar pointed at him and snapped, "You're a stalker," saying that just by staring at his face, you'd instantly know, and then it shooed him away like, "Be quiet." He couldn't stop thinking about how that mysterious woman sprinted up walls like a ninja, and whether an ordinary spirit user could really pull off something that wild. Then, as a sage, he declared he'd go after her the old-fashioned way. This force field formation was a pretty basic spirit art. It let someone prop their whole body up on just one fingertip, blast a force field right where they hit, and tear into wall running, so he figured her wall run was probably powered by the exact same trick. He realized that if he were just a tiny nobody, he might have charged into a reckless fight, but now he was sure as hell of his path. Meanwhile, the spirit avatar leaned in and said, "Climbing walls this tall takes real skill work for a master." Then it added, "And right now, that master is being trained by me." It gestured toward the muscle gorilla. Yes, a trainer in a totally different voice. Then the avatar smirked, sounding like it knew the swordsman's question before he even asked. "All right, just a little more." The swordsman, laser-focused, weighed their next move and promised to turn every lesson from the last battles into fuel for what came after. Then he snapped his attention to the avatar and demanded answers. Was that mysterious woman really nowhere to be found, like he'd expected? After that, he laid it out 2 plans, and both were ready to go. He sketched his first plan, either to tear through the streets hunting for her, or to start grilling everyone he could until he found where she'd vanished. He sat there weighing both choices, weighing every good and bad detail, because this decision couldn't be rushed. The chibi swordsman, right beside the avatar, blurted out that this frantic search now method is their best shot. If luck rides with them, they'll spot her fast and slash the drain on everything that matters, mainly stamina, magic, and time. Then he broke down why that plan was risky. If luck turned sour, it could drag into a long, exhausting chase and burn time and energy fast. So he wondered whether this was really all about gambling, but he shook it off, saying it wasn't that simple, because another test taker was being pushed too. He paused, staring, and realized that mysterious woman wasn't drifting around at random. She was zeroing in on one clear final destination. He was convinced he'd cracked the biggest hint yet about where she finally ended up. When he sat down with Trainer A and spilled his first plan, he said the mysterious woman and examiner was probably already racing toward the final exam spot from the original story, and he was sure he could get there. Then he hit them with the second method: hunt down other examiners, press them for the location of the next exam site, and that whole trick was straight out of the original narrative playbook. He kept going, arguing that because that mysterious woman was an examiner, she must have finished her own test already, so the exam location had to be pretty much set. Trainer A was munching on a snack when he nodded along, agreeing that a fixed location meant they could nail the exact spot. Then she cut in and asked what could go wrong with his plan, warning that chasing down other examiners would eat up time and that a much bigger problem was about to hit. She painted her point so vividly that anyone facing an examiner afterward would almost certainly be stepping straight into a high-stakes showdown. The swordsman finally dropped his blade in defeat, saying he wouldn't join their exam, but he would force them to spill where the next one would be held. Then he broke it down in the game's real rules. If the protagonist knocks out an examiner, they get the next exam's location right away. And with that, he told them to hold the rest of the talk for later. Trainer A snapped that the route ahead wouldn't budge until they crushed an examiner, and then she nervously asked if he'd actually hear her out, even though her opinion was a real headache. He just repeated that they could hash it out later. 5 minutes later, the swordsman spotted a female warrior with her spear cocked and power already roaring through her, and her very presence made his irritation spike. He realized her power wasn't a random move, it was bait for a counterattack, and the examiner vanished, only to snap back behind him and slam him with a swift, shocking strike, leaving him cursing her bold audacity. He tore into Warrior B with a blazing, hard-hitting assault, his blade crashing down like thunder, yet she snapped her spear up to meet every strike, deflecting him so fast, sparks exploded everywhere. Her defense slammed him down hard. His strike got shut down instantly. Then the warrior took a long look and said he'd boosted his armor and used impact mitigation, but asked what he was really trying to do if his goal wasn't to attack her. She admitted he was clearly well trained, then pointed out that the people who usually reach his level don't act like this. She explained she wasn't here to hurt him. She was an examiner, and if he wanted, he could even dodge the test. He stared back at her, clearly taken aback. And then she pushed him again, daring him to prove he really had the guts to go through with it. A dark-haired young woman stared ahead, her eyes hidden behind a sparkling star like glow, and with a trembling, distressed voice she shouted to her sister, standing right beside her, her expression stone serious. Then she stepped up to a swarm of skeletal figures crawling out of the dark, jawless mouths and hollow eye sockets staring straight at her, and with grit in her voice she told them to brace themselves. When the skeletal minions surged in like a tidal wave, she fought tooth and nail, her strikes blurring through the chaos, but the sheer flood of enemies kept pressing her down, and she finally tore loose a desperate scream. Screen. Suddenly, a spiky-haired swordsman burst onto the scene, barking at her to get out of the fight, while above them a light-haired woman hovered in the air, charging up a devastating strike. Then the cornered woman looked down and apologized to the swordsman. Even while she fought, ringed by explosive energy blasts, the floating woman snapped back with a brutal barrage of her own, power surging outward like a shockwave, and the clash kept tearing forward, steel and magic swirling in a furious maelstrom against that relentless skeletal tide. No matter how hard they tried, the weight of everything slammed into her, and her screams tore through the chaos, while her sister, far off, sobbed her name, helpless to break in. She stepped in and begged her sister to end the fight, choking out apologies for being late, while her sister, tears everywhere, looked completely shattered by the crushing weight of battle. In a whole different era, the swordsman faced an armored woman with dark hair pulled into a high ponytail and asked if he could fire off one question before their trial began. She just smirked, like, "Go ahead, you really love asking questions, don't you?" As the trial kicked off, the swordsman suddenly found himself staring down an armored warrior, his fear hitting him hard, so he blurted out that he was terrified and asked, "So, what question do you want to ask me?" He pressed on, swearing he'd take every trial, then shot her a question. Did she know where the other examiners were hiding? At the side, an observer with glasses clocked his wild, fired-up energy, and the swordsman leaned in with a hunch. If he could track down the second-floor examiner, he'd reach the Book of the Wise. The armored warrior thanked him for his answer, and then she dropped her real challenge. She'd only reveal the truth if he could land one clean strike on her using his crimson feather red jewel. She made it clear she wouldn't pull any punches, even if he was her master, then told him to brace himself, and he nodded, ready to fight. With his armor locked in place, the warrior fired up thought acceleration and boosted his leg power. Then he clocked the real twist this trial only wanted one clean hit, so he didn't need to crush anyone with overwhelming force. He also figured the trial was built for speed and that the crushing sense of this was always meant to happen wasn't an accident. It was baked into the design from the start. His eyes widened just a bit as the word inevitable hit him, and a spark of doubt or sudden truth flashed across his mind. Meanwhile, Examiner A, watching from the shadows, flat out warned that charging into a sudden attack like that was pure trouble, because a counterattack could hit them fast, and then she nodded in full agreement with the master's call, while the swordsman, still gripping his massive great sword, listened like every word might decide his life. Then he hefted his massive great sword, and it erupted in dark crackling energy, like the kind of power that was seconds away from bursting free. The examiner pressed him hard, asking why he was using that skill, and if he even planned to show up, so he shot back an apology, saying he just needed a bit more time to get ready. But the armored warrior snapped that he was worthless, pointing out he was way slower than she'd expected. With a thunderous swing, the armored warrior slammed her spear down, carving a huge arc through the air so wide and heavy that even with all his skill, he knew he couldn't dodge that crushing, sweeping strike. He kept dodging Warrior B's non-stop onslaught, scanning for even one crack to strike back, but she never gave him the opening, so he had to wonder if she was pumping herself up with an enhancement skill, because her rhythm looked like it had hit normal limits and kept going anyway. And when Warrior B tracked every move of his feet, she flat out praised his insane leg strength. He mused that sure, her greatsword looked easy to swing, but those brutal wide arcs made dodging almost impossible. Then his sweat poured in and he started hunting for his next move, while she kept hammering forward, feeling his sword speed slip just a hair. But then he realized his attack speed wasn't slowing at all. Something else was happening. Did she just pop another enhancement skill? Panic crawled up his spine and he let out a grunt as her relentless pressure kept smashing down on him. Dread crept in as the swordsman finally grasped the truth he wasn't falling behind. She was ramping up. Faster and faster. He almost reached for a skill to bog her down, but he shut that thought down fast. He needed to crank up his own body even more. Fueled by fresh resolve, the two fighters slammed back into their brutal clash, fists and boots flying as impacts exploded everywhere. The clash raged on as the warrior swung her spear, blasting a sweeping burst of energy that snapped his defenses on fast. No matter how hard he fought, the attack slammed into him, and a shocked cry ripped out of his mouth. The impact hit like a hammer, and dread crashed in every time they collided. He dragged himself slower and slower. He'd trained with agility-boosting skills, so this felt straight up impossible, and Warrior just watched his every move, her face set like stone. Wavering, Warrior B steadied herself, then snapped out her plan with a fierce look. She wasn't hunting his speed. She was going after his agility. Elsewhere, the examiner watched the trial unfold with a cool sip from his cup until a system ping flashed. Time was bleeding off the target, and their mind power had taken a major hit, proving that the delay magic had finally gone off. Skill. Watch this. She broke down the delaying magic piece by piece as the fight raged. It was built to freeze an enemy's motion and mind, then chase them down without letting go. And yeah, it was a release-type skill, but Swordsman A, gifted with long-range attacks, couldn't use it in that exact form. Even as pain crushed him, Swordsman _ fought the unseen pressure like it was a monster, then carved out a deadly, one-of-a-kind style, weaving every move straight into his weapon to land a knockout strike on his opponent's own gear. Examiner _ kept pressing her evaluation, bluntly warning that the Swordsman _'s power transfer move would flop hard because even when it worked, it would only drag the magic down the line, and that brutal suppressive force would leave his opponent's weapon totally defenseless. Right as the tutorial kicked off, Examiner Underscray announced she'd reclaimed her master's time acceleration, built to stop the boss characters from getting wiped out too early, no matter what. Then she worried this fight might be too brutal for a defensive main character, so Swordsman Underscore hit a desperate, last-ditch trigger and activated a skill of his own. The warrior was suddenly caught off guard, then, bam! She realized she was trapped, and in the blink of an eye, the swordsman's form vanished like smoke, leaving nothing but empty space where he'd been. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she murmured, "Splendid." The swordsman sagged, knelt on one knee, and panted like he'd been dragged through a storm, while Warrior B loomed over him, her face easing as she apologized for that brutal, punishing technique, admitting his training still wasn't enough to fully shut it down. Warrior Underscore B's hand shot forward, clutching a tiny, beautifully carved coin, and she declared it was the proof he'd cleared the trial, then smiled and toasted him for the victory he'd truly earned. Warrior B broke into a warm smile and noticed that Swordsman A had already steadied his breath again, then praised him as the real deal when it comes to adventuring. A smiled back, thanked her, and promised she didn't need to worry about pushing him to stand up just yet. Then the swordsman stabbed the truth into the air and told the warrior, Instructor Akabane, to keep her promise, reveal where the next examiner is. He admitted, bitterly, that if she hadn't dropped her guard and started with an attack skill from the very beginning, he might never have won. Just as Swordsman A, Warrior B, and Woman C braced themselves, Examiner A, still cool as ice, announced the next part of the trial was set and told them to begin. Then boom, an ugly, soul-chilling spiritual pressure erupted out of nowhere, snapping Swordsman A and Warrior B into panic mode. Warrior B felt the dread in the air, but swore the source had to be far off. Woman C stared ahead, serious as stone, and demanded if that dark power was coming from the second floor. Swordsman A's eyes went wide, and all he could manage was one terrified thought: no way. The unsettling spiritual power kept surging, bursting into a deafening, guttural roar that rattled the fabric of reality itself, and he, the swordsman, froze with a mix of recognition and terror, choking out his master's name as he realized the terrifying source was, unmistakably, him, while that looming darkness threatened to swallow everything. A sweet young girl with a flower tucked in her hair, chopsticks in hand, happily leaned toward her sister and asked, "Wanna be an adventurer too?" The story teased a creepy tutorial coming for her, showed she was determined not to wreck a boss character, and quietly warned that fate would rip those two close sisters apart. Her pigtail-sporting sister froze with shock at the question, and the first girl blurted out, "So when's the adventure exam?" And the flower-haired girl shot back, "Next month." Next month, she blushed and praised her sister's cooking as delicious, then boldly insisted her sister was destined to make an amazing wife, while the flower-haired girl just beamed at every word. Then she was spotted outside a traditional building, snapping with rage as she demanded one more helping and yelling that it was too soon. Her sister stood nearby, visibly shaken, because she'd been counting on the adventurer qualification exam to be way farther off, only to feel like it was arriving way too fast. While the world spun in a different timeline, a young woman in a school uniform and glasses sprawled on her bed, glued to her book, her mind racing with attack plans and fake expressions, trying to figure out how to fool the examiner, while a tiny blob-like spirit wearing glasses echoed every last bit of her worry and confusion. Her days were already drenched in regret, and she'd resigned herself to it. Then the story flips to ancient records. A 5-year-old girl already labeled a swordsman of the blind gate, a 7-year-old woman who inherits the sword god, Futsu Namatama, and by age 10, a third girl steamrolling every match, sweeping all the battles against 100 different schools. Then they brought her in, and there she knelt, because she'd just been chosen as the next head of the blind gate family. Her eyes carried pure exhaustion as she admitted to herself, "This is too much," and felt not a single spark of excitement anymore. Later, she strode through a crowded school hallway in her uniform, feeling that suffocating weight from her pampered, arrogant mother's nonstop expectations. Yet somehow she kept smashing every mark, consistently landing results way above what anyone ever expected. A young girl strolled through the city, her mind drifting to adventurers like they were legends. Not chores, she didn't feel responsible for anything. But she knew she could pull off the impossible if she just dug in, especially when she thought back to Kashiki Ranka and what he'd done. Her obsession with adventurers lit up the moment she watched that same TV special right then, A spark caught fire inside her. The special had shown her a girl her age, just a student who teamed up with adults, tackled a brutal dungeon, and pulled off results so incredible they left her genuinely stunned. Her eyes shot wide, gleaming with pure awe and fierce hunger as the word adventurers lit up her heart. Then the echoes of dungeons slammed straight into her mind. With a radiant grin, she swore this was her real calling, because beyond the portal lay a wild, unknown world, packed with strange creatures and impossible mysteries that adventurers chased non-stop. The scene snapped open into her childhood memory. Young, her beamed with pure excitement, swearing to her older sister that she was going to become an adventurer, and her sister only smiled softly, urging her to go chase it. The young girl pumped her fist, face blazing with grit, declaring she'd become an adventurer for sure, while her sister practically burst with excitement. And then, after all that waiting, the day she'd been begging for finally hit the adventurer qualification exam kicked off. In Imperial Year 1190, spring, the wait was over. Dungeon City Sakura threw everyone into the 27th dungeon, Moonflower, on the first floor, and the second the exam started, violence exploded. Woman_D in full armor snapped her spear skillfully at a goblin and a kobold, while Warrior_B went toe-to-toe with a towering, massive monster. Suddenly, she spotted a flash of motion, one blurred figure tearing past like lightning, leaving the girl in her school uniform frozen in pure shock. She weighed her choices and chatted with the squishy, blob-shaped avatar, then figured the dungeon would always be there for practice, so why not scout the other examinees first? A sudden idea hit like lightning, and she chose to watch the participants' abilities instead. Elsewhere, a brutal battle boiled over a swordsman, and a mysterious woman fought goblins and kobolds as the player got blindsided, screamed when an arrow hit, and realized it was a death blow. He cursed that he'd need time to recover, while the mysterious woman watched the chaos unfold with eerie calm. Lost in her own thoughts, she grilled the examinees. Were they all just like the figures she'd seen a second ago? She kicked herself for not clocking the one who'd been tailing them, just to measure their real power. Then it hit her. The examiner was brutally, insanely strong. Just as her thoughts started to settle, the examiner, sharp, distinguished, and wearing glasses, stepped in and cut her off, declaring, "You're ready." Then he laid down the rules like a challenge thrown straight at her. The trial starts now, and if she can land even one clean hit on him before the second round ends, she wins. He stood there, locked and loaded, daring her to start the trial the moment she was ready. With a burst of speed, she exploded into the attack so fast her after-images multiplied, and no one could track where she really was. But the examiner barely even blinked. He swatted it all away with one raised hand, like it was nothing, then declared that she'd surrendered because not a single hit ever landed. The examiner's eyes widened. She had to admit he was way stronger than she'd expected, and she shot him a sharp, questioning look, like, "Did you really hold back your true power?" Strength surged, then she blurted, "Wait!" and demanded her moment. "I really did pass the trial, so don't snatch it away." Inside, she begged with every breath to keep her dream, her whole future as an adventurer. With a dazzling grin, she thanked him, took the medal he held out, and said dead sure that she always gets exactly what she wants. She wanted answers, and the examiner, still stunned by her raw power, pressed her on where she trained. With a steady voice, she said she trained at an ancient martial arts dojo right in her family home. As she talked, her gaze dropped to the wrecked floor beneath them, proof of every brutal hour, and for a moment, she just wished something would finally light a real fire in her. Her excitement got ripped apart the instant a towering, dark skeletal monster erupted into existence with a brutal, guttural roar, cracking the ground until it shattered around it, startling her, Examiner A, and every adventurer nearby, including Player A, Swordsman A, Mysterious Woman A, and that lone man in the long coat, all staring in stunned silence. Then the creature exploded into existence, screeching with a long, bone-chilling roar that tore through the broken space, while its monstrous shape swallowed the whole area. The monstrous thing surged forward, its skeletal hand snatching through the air, and the man in the long coat froze in pure terror, while protagonist A, eyes blazing wide, wondered if this nightmare was even supposed to show up for the examination. The man's face twisted with panic as he blurted out why this sudden variant had shown up, insisting no one had ever filed a report like this, before protagonist A stayed calm and said the whole thing was definitely off, while examiner A watched her reaction like it mattered. Amid the chaos, the protagonist A snapped her sword out and stared down the storm with iron resolve, while the long coat man, revealed as an examiner, asked whether she was calling for backup, then pushed her to run and split their roles. She fired back, wondering if this sudden variant was really what they thought, because she knew the creature too well, and the examiner finally admitted it was brutally, unbelievably dangerous. Danger hit right as the examiner yanked her away before she could fight. Hauling her back with brutal force, he shouted that they had to run, barking that the thing was a monster that hunted adventurers, and making it crystal clear if she got what was happening, then retreat was the only move. He crumpled into a desperate plea. Then the examiner laid it all out. This creature had flaws so monstrous they even dwarfed the final floor guardians in weak dungeons, and the numbers proved it had power that crushed everything else. Still gripping her, he growled that neither of them stood a chance against an opponent like that alone, and that was exactly why, as the examiner, he felt forced to. She listened with her eyes shut, weighing every word like it might shatter her world, because two people running from a monster this strong felt pointless, so she decided one should stay behind and stall it while the other sprinted to summon allies. Right as she weighed her choices, a tiny metallic ring slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the ground, right when the examiner was about to tack on yet another point to his case. She stared at the examiner with a tiny, trembling smile as he begged, desperate, urgent for her to survive, swearing that at least one person had to crawl out alive from this nightmare. A deathbringer of bone and menace towered over everything skeletal, monstrous, wrapped in filthy rags, cradling a massive scythe that screamed danger. They called it a sudden variant, and the real shock was its wind scythe, way too fresh, almost disturbingly perfect in how brutally it could end a life. With the danger roaring in the background, the examiner sank into a deep bow and begged her to trust him with what comes after vowing, word for word, that he'd rush in to help, urging her to stay strong until with a smug, almost playful grin, she braced herself and flipped the switch on a devastating ability. Her legs lit up with otherworldly energy as she powered up her strength, ready to charge straight into the challenge. She darted forward like lightning, snapping out of the skeletal monster's swing with a grin so wide it looked fearless, and she even silently thanked the thing for showing up like, "Yes, you're here now. Perfect." In Damachi, getting hurt doesn't mean you're done. There are recovery tools like the healing potion that kicks your body's natural healing into overdrive. Still, these recovery items don't come clean, sure. They crank up your body's healing power, but they also smack you with fatigue, so using them non-stop gets rough fast, especially for top-tier people. After all the usual healing stuff, there's one treasure people whisper about like it's magic the panacea, a cure-all potion that can mend any wound or illness, way beyond what humans can even understand, but it's so rare you'll only ever find it in the deepest, most dangerous parts of dungeons. Then the story pivots to a tutorial where a mysterious woman steps in and tells everyone, straight up, that if you're clueless and can't heal, you come to her for recovery fast. She also warns that the tutorial boss isn't here to play, slamming you with brutal debuffs and gutting damage, so you better learn how to survive before you get wiped. And then it hits you. Learn even the enemies have ways to heal. Some monsters steal back a chunk of health with every attack, but this brand new skeletal monster is worse. It runs a skill called soul reconstruction non-stop, constantly rebuilding itself. Moments later, a brutal brawl explodes. Dark-haired warrior woman, yoked by skeletal arms, launches a devastating sweeping strike at a shadowy skeletal monster, her every move a lightning-fast blur of control. She keeps hammering forward, blade whipping through the air with brutal force, and the skeletal monster jerks back from every hit, trying, but failing, to hold its ground against her relentless flurry of strikes. She snaps out of the monster's counter in a heartbeat, twisting mid-air to slip the hit, then slams down again with a razor-fast strike, pure, deadly agility and control. She locks in on her own movements and realizes, holy hell, everything feels faster than it should. Yet she doesn't miss a beat. unleashing a storm of pinpoint, explosive hits into the skeletal enemy still trying to regenerate. She kept battering the monster non-stop, but every hit slid off like it meant nothing. Its regeneration wasn't just some trick, it was who it was. She flashed across the battlefield at breakneck speed, a total blur, yet the monster kept standing there, refusing to fall. She tore through the darkness like a blur, light streaking off her swift strikes as she slammed into the skeletal figure with razor-true precision. Even after she fought her hardest, that skeletal monster shattered into dark energy and bone. Then it started stitching itself back together, reforming from the ruins. As the monster started to stitch itself back together again, she couldn't ignore how brutal its healing power was and how impossible this fight was going to feel. Then she clenched her teeth, wondering why she kept battling, even with her speed now amped up, and what all this struggle was actually for. The skeletal monster tore into the air with a gut-wrenching roar, its empty eye sockets locked on her. Then she flashed that stubborn, determined look and blurted how thrilled she was to finally break free, ready to unleash every ounce of strength as the challenge sent her tension spiking higher. Right as she reached for her next strike, chains blasted out of the ground, wrapping her arms, legs, and chest like a trap. Then her katana clattered away as she stared, stunned, at the sudden bindings. She thrashed against the chains, biting into her skin, and a brutal wave of realization hit she had zero strength, pinned down tight, unable to move or fight back. As she stared at the tangled chains, it hit her without her weapon. Her contracted spirit couldn't be called at all, and she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She still didn't know nearly enough for a world this huge and brutal. Dangling from the chains, she swallowed her pride and admitted her naivety, because this monster wasn't attacking at random. It had only been waiting for its opening. And somehow, even trapped like this, a weird little surge of almost joyful relief burned in her chest. Pinned with her body unable to move, the skeletal monster towered over her, and dread crashed in. Was defeat coming? Should she run, or should she just give up and die? Then, a weak voice cut through her thoughts, begging her to keep fighting if she still had the heart. She was drowning in deep regret, a quiet apology meant for someone far away, and as her short, fleeting life began to slip out of her hands, even then, her destiny too huge to vanish into, death refused to be finished. Her body, now twisted into a terrifying new form, got seized because the contracted spirit monster slipped inside and made her its fresh vessel, then swore it would slaughter anyone who stood against it, raging on until it finally reached its true fulfillment. Still trapped, she watched as a brand new figure stepped out of the shadows, an even sword saint, sent to fulfill a promise from ages ago. He cut through the air itself, his brutal power ripping open the illusion like it was nothing. World felt like it turned to iron chains snapped tight and yanked her deeper into the monster's grip, her face twisting in a silent, brutal scream of shock and pain. Still trapped, she stared up as the hulking skeletal monster towered over her, its terrifying power rolling outward like a wave. Then a voice snapped through the chaos, calling out its motives and demanding to know if it really meant to hurt someone so fragile. Ichiro Shimizu stepped up to the other woman and introduced himself, saying he'd heard about the first floor exam and that he was here to take part as an examiner, just like her. Then he announced he was going to trigger the human spirit fusion form, an intense procedure that would slam his master's communication and reflective actions into sync and kick off a neural link. Before anything started, he demanded his master's permission. Meanwhile, the skeletal monster stays eerily still, its massive power blasting through the air, but nothing about it visibly moves as everything else unfolds as if it's just waiting to strike. As the fusion finished, the bound woman shot Shimizu a desperate look, begging him to snap her chains off right then and there. He gripped the chain that pinned her, and even with energy snapping around her, Woman C hissed that as long as those shackles held, she couldn't unleash her full power. With raw strength cracking through her, the chain snapped moments later, and Woman C, now glowing with power, burst free. Swordsman lunged to catch her before she toppled, asking if she could stay. She caught her breath and let out a soft laugh, admitting she truly thought it was all over, but she'd taken a look and realized she wasn't hurt on the outside. Then she gripped a glowing orb and checked her status like a lifeline. No spiritual damage at all, just a little fatigue," she said. He stared at her, shock ripping across his face, realizing she was truly unhurt. As she stared at him, he dove his hand into his pocket and told her he'd have something ready, something she could use to slip away from where they were stuck. Then she asked, straight up, what it was. Then he pulled out a tiny, beautifully carved bottle and said it was a healing activator meant to slam her spiritual power back into full strength, fast. She stared at the bottle, then snapped her eyes back to him, seeing his warmth in every little act he helped her. And he even handed her something that felt like the start of an adventure still. She couldn't help wondering if he was genuinely good, or if kindness like that was even allowed. With a huge grin, she dared the world to try stopping her. "I can still fight." He snapped his gaze aside, shouting that it was a terrible idea and that she had to get away right now. She shot back a flat no, and he reminded her she'd literally been one step from death. "I know," she fired back. She leaned in toward it, then bowed so deeply her eyes shut tight, pouring out raw, heartfelt gratitude for the help that saved her. She shoots a determined but playful grin, tilts her head, winks, and asks if this state works, then gets ready to unleash the next move. She whips around to Swordsman A, eyes blazing with pure grit, and demands they team up to take down the monster, because even after nearly killing her, it doesn't flinch at all. Behind them, the other watchers stare hard, and Swordsman A watches right back, face grim, with a skull lying nearby. As she speaks, the skeletal monster lashes out again. Dark, heavy chain after chain crashes toward the swordsman, and Swordsman A snaps into action, screaming that they need to dodge now because this is probably only more chains, telling everyone to sharpen their senses before it's too late. Swordsman Rocket jumps into the air, dodging those crushing chains as they whip past him, then clocks how the monster won't stop hunting Woman C like it's totally obsessed, so he seethes and calls it a Lullacon master. He drops in hard, eyes locked on the monster as its chains keep crawling back to life the second they're shattered, so he realizes it's not just the chains he has to stop, but the power behind their endless reboot. He steels himself, checks his footing, and decides he's got to refill his stamina. Then he's coming back to reload the chains. Inside his mind, the spirit avatar and player A hash out what's happening. Then the avatar says the master's answer was spot on, while player A leans in and demands, "So what do we do next?" Meanwhile, Woman C perks up and blurts that everything Swordsman A just said is dead on, and she's feeling incredible, like she's ready to wipe the helped princess's enemies off the map. Then she urges them to switch tactics and team up for real. Together, the swordsman grinds through his thoughts and agrees right then and there. He tells her to hand over her power, then warns her to stay sharp while he traps the chains by sandwiching them from the left and the right. She barely registers his plan before her whole body snaps into motion, blasting forward at insane speed to slam their coordinated attack into place. With each stride, her simple sandal hits the ground with a solid, fearless thud. She's locked in, ready to fight. And the swordsman who's watching her can't help it. Surprise slips out of his mouth. He faces the masked figure with a steel grin and tells him, "I've got one thing to say before we go any further." Elsewhere, a young woman with dark hair flashes a bright smile, tells everyone her name is Haruka, and asks for confirmation. Behind the two men, the masked figure confesses why he hesitated, because all he knows is a doomed ending. Then he drops the truth on swordsman Ada Ponder. He whips around to Haruka, urging her to finally unleash her true power. Then she just gives a quiet nod. With a fierce, unshakable look, she shouts Shimizu's name and steels herself for whatever hits next, because the road ahead is about to smash destiny wide open and take them beyond. Meet Kanata Dungeon Magia's beloved heroine, all graceful beauty and battle-ready fury, chosen as the next successor to a legendary sword school, the kind of warrior maiden who truly feels like a hero. A fresh character popularity poll drops, and the rankings hit like a punch. Sword Arthur Caldwolf storms in first, Raspos grabs second, Chris Chanel Holy Maiden lands third, Kanata comes in fourth, and Aoi, the main heroine, finishes fifth. Then the story snaps to Alwoy, an elite demigod-type warrior with a mid-tier god-class status, brandishing her family's legendary greatsword, the Heavenly Wing Slash. Kanata's combat power gets even more terrifying. Her usual hit lands one brutal swing, but her special technique lets her unleash hundreds of strikes at once, splitting the attack across multiple targets and shredding them with savage precision. Even with Kanata's killer skills, she's still crushed, slumped on the ground, defeated, Turns out her route is brutally difficult from the start, and the max level is locked so hard it makes her climb feel nearly impossible. She stays pinned to the ground, crushed by the nightmare of the mob enemies. These monsters chain status attacks, wipe allies in a single hit, snatch items and levels without mercy, and even flip invincible for a while. Then, right on cue, they resurrect their fallen teammates every turn and hunt her down together, relentlessly, like a coordinated pack. While Kanata crumples in defeat, Sword Arthur Caldwolf charges in like a storm, battling side by side with her as a flood of skeletal warriors closes in, plus a terrifying shadowy boss known as Sword Shura. She's falling apart in total despair because her whole route and the truth of the world behind it gets ripped open and questioned, and the story starts asking the terrifying question, can these core problems ever be fixed, or is this entire nightmare already cut short? A trembling hand cradles a busted, star-shaped thing, its jagged cracks screaming that hope has splintered, or that disaster just struck somewhere in the chaos. Sword Arthur Caldwolf stands beside Chris Chanel, eyes widening in shock. Then rage flares in his throat as he yells in anger and frustration, "Oh, you!" Because that outburst means a brutal new trial is about to begin, and it's calling his name right now. In the spring of Imperial Calendar 1190, right before Ichiro Shimizu was about to bolt to Raspos on the first floor of the 27th dungeon, Moon Cave Wolf, the sword Arthur called out of Sakura City's Moon Cave, got stopped cold. They demanded to know if he was the second-floor examiner, then pressed hard to find out if he was the one who'd asked the very first question. Glasses on, the examiner barked a warning that the road ahead was deadly for any examinee. So when Sword Arthur called Wolf and demanded to know what happened, the examiner shot back, asking if Wolf had truly cleared the Red Feather trial and earned his spot as an examiner. The examiner burst in and revealed his real body had suddenly appeared in the waiting area, and the girl who was the examiner raced to help him get out. He snapped with rage at how powerless his magic left him, then begged Sword Arthur Caldwolf with shaking urgency to save that girl, now stuck fighting alone. And when Sword Arthur Caldwolf heard the details, the truth hit him. She was the long-haired girl. He knew his girl. Sword Arthur Caldwolf blurted out that he was heading in to help, promising he'd report to operations later. Yet the examiner standing there went pale with shock and tried to stop him, insisting the second-floor examiner was just a lucky examinee, and that this examiner was the one you could actually trust. The examiner insisted Sword Arthur Caldwolf would have to save her betting everything on the kid's real strength, then thrust out a hand with a small rectangular object in it. Sword Arthur Caldwolf stared at it, wondering what on earth it was. He snapped open the object, and it turned out to be a battlefield map. Then he ordered Sword Arthur Caldwolf to race back for reinforcements and hold the line until they arrived. Caldwolf nodded without hesitation, accepting the mission and promising he'd leave right away. As he charged ahead, his master's voice snapped in, "If you know the exact fight zone, trigger body reinforcement the moment before you hit the enemies." He nodded right away, fully locked in on why it mattered. He figured the second-floor examiner was right to send him, because a huge destiny was about to open up, and as Kanata fought a skeletal monster with everything she had, she realized she couldn't just sit and wait for help that would take forever. She thanked the examiner for yanking her out of danger, and she was honestly glad she'd met him. She kept up her brutal attack, furious at the idea of throwing an injured person and an examinee straight into that kind of death trap, and she knew the examiner had gambled hard the moment she trusted her to Sword Arthur Caldwolf, fully aware she might not survive. Determined to clear the first-floor trial, no matter what it cost, she swore she'd never let Sword Arthur Caldwolf die. And then the truth hit her. Her original plan was to back him up only after he finished his own trial. Kanata burst into a flurry of strikes, hammering the skeletal monster with a brutal multi-hit barrage, her grit never wavering, and while she fought, she couldn't help thinking her master might be a little clumsy. Kanata keeps hammering away at that skeletal monster, slamming its massive weapon aside with her blade while her eyes track every move, watching it move faster than should be possible, leaving ghost-like afterimages in its wake and making it clear this thing isn't acting like a normal creature at all. She keeps hammering through the chaos, snapping her guard up and dodging every monster's sweeping swings with razor-precise strikes. Then she admits her hits won't crack that hardened shell, and still, she won't back down, fighting tooth and nail to protect the person counting on her. While Sword Arthur, nicknamed Wolf, stares down the brutal fight, he swears to himself the battle is playing out exactly like his plan. But right when it should feel certain, a sharp doubt flashes. What if this monster is even stronger than he ever expected? Then he remembers a past chat with Chris Chanel where, exposed and shaking, she'd promised to help him take down that guy and do the thing he asked for, and now he's ready to cash in on that pact. As the monster barrels in on Kanata, he doesn't panic. He keeps talking to himself, locked on the massive spiritual power he's siphoning from Chris Chanel, telling his own body to keep feeding it until his technique is finished, even as he warns that one slip could drown him in all that raw force. He goes deeper into body reinforcement, how it's basically a spiritual power sponge, and uses a killer metaphor. One rice ball is all the spiritual power you need for basic reinforcement, but his current, complicated technique would take a whole mountain of rice balls. And the scary part is, he's already drained every last drop of his own spiritual power, so now he can only survive by drawing from something outside himself. Hinata is still trapped in the fight, and she vows with full conviction she'll bring this monster down because everything hinges on its defeat. Sword Arthur, shouting for Wolf, watches the monsters keep tearing forward and vows, no doubt in his voice, that his technique will crush even the toughest fighter yet. While he's still locked in battle, he admits the full move is so brutally complex that, in any normal situation, it feels downright impossible. Kanata fights tooth and nail against the monster's non-stop assault, shouting in pure frustration as panic hits. She has to pull off a special move, right now. At the same time, Sword Arthur Caldwell finally jumps fully into the fray and rips through with a brutal strike that detonates a massive blast of energy. He flips on body reinforcement, and his whole form lights up like it's packed with lightning. Then he realizes something wild. Even with his spiritual power sitting at 0, the reinforcement he triggered right before the limit still keeps working. This kind of reinforcement isn't on all the time, it's an anytime you choose trigger. And that's exactly why it's deadly, because when he hits, it's a devastating blow. He figured it'd be fine to finish the technique just as it was until Kanata, standing right next to him, called him Master and asked if he was unhappy. And suddenly, his thoughts were spiraling. She admitted it was maddening, like he'd been battling solo the whole time, and every time he got hurt, she had to scramble to patch him back up, while that skeletal monster still blazed in flames, looming like a nightmare, and he just nodded along, accepting it all. Her eyes popped wide as she blurted that he was incredible, and said it totally made sense why they called him Shimizu-ken. Then he spun back to her, stunned by the way she suddenly hyped him up. She said his strategy wasn't the point, because he had a real plan. Then she rattled it off fast. He was baiting the enemy, leaving openings on purpose so they'd lunge at him. And he was regenerating his own body too. And she couldn't help but wonder why. Keep that reckless rhythm. As she talked, Sword Arthur had Wolf on the spot, and his face twisted with mounting dread. She kept going, saying his regeneration was guzzling an insane amount of spiritual power, and that he was purposely eating attacks to supercharge his own strikes, something she couldn't wrap her mind around. Then it all snapped. Wolf erupted, roaring at her to shut up. Even after his outburst, the skeletal monster ripped the air with a guttural roar, and Kanata snapped a warning that chains were about to come flying at them. Then she shot into motion, ready to throw down with the beast. As she shifted, Kanata blurted that the monster's moves were almost readable, but it took its sweet time to actually fire, because it had to haul its attacks into motion, slow and clunky. So we don't stand close, she warned. We carve out distance with every setup move. Meanwhile, that creature's sword spiral had always relied on slick, dodging bursts, but now it had changed, growing sluggish and heavy, like the spiral itself was bogging down. Seeing the monster in its brand new form, Kanata snapped that Sword Arthur Caldwell should fall back, and Arthur nodded, agreeing to retreat with her. Right before Kanata pulled back, she snapped out her plan. She'd been hammering one spot, but now she saw the real weakness, the thing's regeneration. So that's what they had to target. Then she fired the question at him. How do we beat it? He grinned and said, we obliterate it with sheer firepower, no chance to heal. And with that, Kanata issued a hard, decisive command. Move fast and help me tear this monster apart. She kept hammering her attack, staring as the skeletal monster stitched itself back together, and she caught the new rhythm in how it moved. Sword Arthur stood right beside her, and he couldn't shake the question, was this thing really an ally Or was it evolving into something more dangerous? That monster's regeneration kept hammering on its bony body, reknitting itself as fresh skeletal figures crawled out of the shadows, and the crowd of them kept growing, wave after wave. As the horde swelled, she shouted that her prediction was dead on. Then her voice cracked as she realized the skeletal masses had them boxed in completely. He dove straight into the melee, swinging that massive sword to cut a bloody lane through the creeping skeletal monsters, yet more kept pouring in, like the end would never come. Seeing him fight through it, she pressed him with a voice full of challenge, and it totally caught him off guard. He flashed a huge, confident grin and promised he'd wipe out the trash skeletons swarming around them, and she laughed at his evil look because it somehow fit. Then he snapped back into strategy and asked her what their next move should be. Then she spilled her plan in one breath she'd lure the skeletal horde, while he tore into the main monster with a devastating technique. Right where it hurts, she leaned in, hunted for his say-so, and asked what he thought of her strategy. He instantly went along with her plan. Then he froze. Like a thought hit him hard, admitting he had one last worry swirling in his head, and it left her staring in shock. Fueled by fresh determination, he barreled straight at the massive monster, shouting for her to play along with it while she snapped into action, mowing down the swarming smaller skeletons with razor-quick, spot-on strikes. The monster strike hit him hard, proving it was way worse than anything before, so he knew he couldn't dodge a second time and had to act fast, because his master could drain out spiritual power endlessly. He tore into the fight with a massive sweeping slash, his blade whistling through the air and smashing into the shadowy skeletal monster. While the battle raged, Kanata kept her eyes on him and blurted out that the monster's corrupted ability structure wasn't planned. It was a sudden mutation, and they couldn't mess around against something this dangerous. A skeletal monster towered over them, its eyes burning with pure malice, basically bragging, "I'm not some lowly nobody, I'm in a league of my own." He planted his feet, locked his eyes on that monstrous threat, and forced himself to clench his guard and stay razor alert, because one careless second was all the darkness needed. With a blood-curdling roar, he slammed into the horde, promising he'd fight with every last bit of his killing will. He knew strategy was out the window now, but as a gamer, he was ready to prove exactly what he could do. He kept hammering forward, screaming at that monstrous thing and staring it down like it could blink first, calling out the wretch who haunts people and devours souls for trying to run and swearing he'd never turn his back on a straight-up one-on-one. Even with all his grit, the monster snapped back with a brutal counterattack. Its shadow slammed into him like a wrecking ball. He screamed as it hurled him away, and the thing taunted him, crowning itself the winner after driving him down. Kanata watched him crash to the ground, panic blazing in her mind as she hunted for how that monster even defended itself. Was it wearing some kind of fake shield? Lying sprawled on the ground, he stared up at the towering monster and felt it bait him on purpose. Then his mind raced, wondering how tough it really was and whether he'd been tricked into charging recklessly. Kanata dropped to her knees beside him, cradling his battered body as she dug into the monster's weird physiology, then fired questions at him about where its eyes and optic nerves were hiding. She stared at the skeletal monster and watched its crushed eyes claw their way back, regenerating in real time, so she couldn't help wondering if it could keep healing until it was truly whole. Meanwhile, Sword Arthur, finally back on his feet, braced himself in front of the monster, realizing their hits wouldn't cut it because it just keeps regenerating. So he told everyone they had to shut down that regeneration first before they even dared to finish any other move. He kept going, his frustration flaring as he was forced to fall back from the enemy, and he worried sick about what that retreat would dump on her while he geared up. Even with his worries gnawing at him, Sword Arthur slammed in with a brutal strike, ripping chunks off the monster's body. He snapped that if this was just a trick, it wouldn't matter at all, and while the fight exploded in front of them, Kanata and Aoi just stared, locked on every second. As the monster snapped back, he spun to his crew and demanded they figure out what kind of power this was, because if it was a real skill, they could counter it, but if it was some freak mutation, they'd have to improvise on the spot. And honestly, he couldn't stop wondering whether the examiner saw this coming. The monster's real nature finally snapped into view, born from a sword, then suddenly mutated into something that could unleash a normal attack times 6 and even capture with a bind and summon move. and Kanata realized it had outgrown its old form, now packed with even more bone. Seriously, I can't stop wondering what triggered this crazy leap. As Aoi stared in fear, the monster's summoning power kicked in, and a swarm of tiny skeletal fighters started crawling into the air, each one gripping a sword. Sure, one by itself wouldn't matter, but that endless crowd, it was downright terrifying. Hinata stared down the crushing odds and made her move, face set in steel, as she snapped, "No more waiting," summoning a swarm of swords that hovered around her, ready to strike the moment the fight began. The secret behind the Funomitama got exposed. Turning out it's a Danmachi-sized power, linked to how Saint Rasbo's unsealed sword could unleash something impossible. Siri Funomitama. Yeah, that spirit was stamped as a divine class, mid-level being, packed with divine-style martial arts power, and the reason hit hard. Aoi, the masked warrior, had forged a contract with it, just like she'd done with both her older and younger sisters, the Timba Henabiki. Arthur Caldwolf stared at his own blade, wrestling with what he could really do. His nurturing power didn't just grow swords, it let him copy and twist them to his will, and he couldn't stop wondering if the strength he felt was the real deal or just an illusion. He figured out he could only stack 6 replicated swords, and they had to be ones he already had in his hands. Then he realized these copied blades didn't run on autopilot. They needed him to step in and control them himself. He kept digging into his power, realizing he had to master where every copied item sat in space and control them from afar, like some brutal game debuff forcing him to juggle 2 techniques at once just to swing and grab resources, and he couldn't stop thinking about how far those limits truly went. He figured the number of swords he could copy was tiny real precision, real sensitivity, or they wouldn't even work in his hands. Then he looked at the Timba Henabiki and saw it ran on a blunt left-right rule, nothing like his method at all, and that's when it hit him like lightning. If he had a sister, he'd get 0 rewards, so it was basically a simple Koro-style setup. He wrestled with the Funomitama and couldn't shake the fear that nobody could use it trouble-free, then remembered Aoi had a contract and was already collecting compensation, so he decided it was time to dig into Sword Street Rasbo's next move. He knew his ability was enough, but it didn't feel like real power. Then he saw it had been tossed aside and warped, locking in strength and boosting his attacks by a brutal 18 times. Now he couldn't stop wondering how much of the original ability was still usable, because anyone who understood Damage's true power still didn't know what it really could do. While that mystery hung in the air, Always slipped forward with deadly grace, dual-wielding 2 katanas. Suddenly, one crushing slash from a single sword tore through the air, then a brutal 2-horn attack slammed down and shattered the ground, blasting debris everywhere. A blinding flash ripped through the air, and then a ruthless triangular barrage detonated before it spread into a 4-sided assault, ramped up to a brutal 5-point suppression, and swallowed the whole area in a roaring storm of destruction. In the middle of the chaos, Kanata exploded forward at blinding speed, tearing into the 6-flower chaos, technique sword after sword, ripping into the air, flashing into existence just to slam together with a brutal, bone-jarring clash. She kept hammering forward, every move a streak of motion, and as the chaos roared louder around her, her savage battle cries filled the air. While the battle raged, Kanata blurted out that the Funomitama she'd fused with was a divine class, mid-level spirit that came packed with divine martial arts, yet the official records clearly warned that no one should be able to unleash its full power and right. As she spoke, Sword Arthur froze, eyes bulging in shock, when that shadowy skeletal monster loomed behind him. A cloned sword flickered into existence, just a plain little blade, and the narrator was quick to shut the hype down. Even though it was replicated, it wasn't some special treasure, just a regular supply sword. Sword Arthur, still shaking from the revelation, stared at Kanata in the distance, and panic hit hard when he realized she was freely bending the skeletal monsters to her will, controlling them with an ease that made his brain refuse to understand. He kept his eyes on her as she slipped into multiple places at once, tangling with every enemy in sight. And he couldn't shake the thought that skills like over-aim and trace assist shouldn't even be real yet. Her moves kept plodding with surgical precision. Then it hit him, cold as ice. These weren't illusions at all. They were Raspos's clones, still cradling Chris protectively in his arms. Sword Arthur assured her there was nothing wrong on their end. Then his focus snapped to the unseen presence, and he demanded answers like, "Tell me what's going on," while Kanata raged through her fight in the background. The skeletal monster let out a bone-chilling snarl, staring someone down and spitting, "Lulacan stalker bastard!" Sword Arthur, still clutching Chris in his arms, snapped that he didn't know if they'd truly finished off that guy, while the examiner official beside him wore a grim face and admitted the stalker wasn't just some nobody. He was a master, which meant something far worse was out there. The examiner official had barely finished the warning when Sword Arthur called Wolf stepped up to the skeletal monster, watching it barely twitch like it had been like this from the start, biding its time to ambush him inside its attack range, and that massive bone-filled pit beneath him, it answered everything. This was the monster's great maw, the place that swallowed his opponent whole. That skeletal monster looked like it was getting wrecked, even pretending to drop. But it wouldn't stay down for a second. It kept healing itself non-stop. Sword Arthur, now teamed up with Kanata, kept his eyes locked on the monster, and he realized you couldn't just smash it to pieces. Normal fighting wouldn't wipe it out for good. The real question burned in him. Why did it have that savage predator's power to gulp everything into its huge mouth? And next to him, Kanata stared like this was the last thing they expected. He glanced down at Kanata, slumped against him with that deep, thinking look on her face, and she said that if he wanted to chase efficiency, he'd have to sing praises for what she just did. Kanata then told her that if she went straight for the trap, regular fighting would get her nowhere. She'd burn through resources fast, and her spirit would have to clamp down and choke the flow, while that skeletal monster loomed behind them, pure menace. She kept going, saying any attack could be wiped out with the right move, and that refusing to talk would only breed this crushing feeling of uselessness and inferiority. Then somehow that becomes the excuse to outlaw it. Sword Arthur stared down the skeletal monster and swallowed her words like they were truth, muttering that difficult never fit anything better, then asking her straight up if this thing's sacrificial role was real. Meanwhile, the examiner explained that the beginner-only Moon Touch dungeon would spit out nothing but weak, low-level foes on its 5th floor, and he even remembered that, in the original setup, the Sword Saint Ras boss monster wasn't meant to be that brutal. Then he jabbed a finger at 2 tiny goblin-like creatures and a chibi adventurer, stressing that the guild picked this dungeon precisely because it was supposed to be easy for the exam. And the big question hit him, could something like this really be happening? The examiner kept going. Moon Touch's spirits were trapped in there, turned into brutal boss monsters, and once they were forced into cursed contracts, the place turned into a hunting ground where they got chased down non-stop for their spirit stones. Sword Arthur clenched his jaw and stared straight at the truth. Weakness wasn't just a feeling, it was a target. He realized their regrets and sorrows could stack up until they couldn't take another hit. If they were weak, people would shove them aside. If they were weak, they wouldn't stand a chance to fight. And once that weakness showed, the world would crush them without mercy. Above him, the skeletal monster's skull loomed like a brutal warning. He stood rock solid as swirling energy ripped around his hand, eyes locked sharp and unshaking. Then you could feel that burning conviction in his chest. Because he didn't pretend otherwise, he fought to survive, even if it meant admitting he was weak. Just as this truth hit him, his gaze dropped to Kanata, crumpled on the ground and badly hurt. She groaned and tried to lift herself, whispering with a failing voice, asking if he really was her master. His feet drove forward with purpose, but inside his head, the truth kept echoing. He couldn't be saved, and that was the whole, brutal ending. He spun toward the towering skeletal monster and stared it down, daring it to say whatever it had to say. No fear in his voice. The monster ripped the air apart with a guttural roar, then blasted forward with a savage attack. He slammed into the impact. Shockwaves hammered the ground beneath him, and he braced hard for the crushing blow. He didn't even flinch at the monster's assault. His face slid from deep focus into a calm, almost unsettling smirk, like he'd already sized everything up. And then he murmured, "Is that so?" A wild, almost manic grin snapped across his face as he taunted the monster, declaring that adventurers like them were beyond mercy. Then he dropped a chilling thought. He was grateful Saikon wasn't nearby, because if he was, everything would flip and their luck would die. His eerie grin wouldn't fade as he taunted the monster, acting like getting hit was exactly what it should do. Meanwhile, Aoi planted himself protectively over the injured Kanata, watching every strange move like she'd seen it before. Kanata, still foggy-headed, only managed to mumble his title, and Aoi clocked just how at home he looked in moments like this. He kept a wild inner universe in his chest, swearing he loved it while plotting to tear it down, and he told himself his true dream was to rescue the people who couldn't rescue themselves. A bold, tangled goal that somehow fit him perfectly. With his thoughts laid bare, he spun around and strode off, leaving one last, stubborn moment hanging in the air, like a quiet promise that the next phase of his master plan was about to ignite. He jabbed a finger straight at the skeletal monster, rage and determination burning in his eyes, and swore that it had pushed its luck too far because its dark deeds would end right here. No escape. Kanata kept roaring his fierce promise, saying the monster would accomplish nothing, and that this very moment would end its existence, while his voice rang out like a final bell. The master's time was up, and Al's spiritual power had just come roaring back. With a burst of crackling energy, a system message flashed that their full second-order extermination magic formula End of Origin was finally built, then snapped to rapid activation, locking them into the origin sequence. And with that brutal aura around him, he roared that their ultimate technique was done. Kanata broke down the end of the beginning and unveiled the ultimate weapon Albion from Dungeon Magia. Then she dropped the real twist: the hero who's usually trapped wasn't just some player at all, but a goddess who bends time and controls causality. She kept going and told him she didn't just stop time, she could speed it up and even rewind it. Arthur tore into the battlefield with a storm of instant long-range shots hitting from everywhere at once as multiple projectiles blasted simultaneously, and then he froze, wondering if someone had warned him about this before. He sat there, staring at the terrifying idea that time acceleration could wipe existence clean and blast anything clear to the ends of the earth, then realized the real nightmare. How do you even fight something that lives across 4 dimensions, with matter, spirit, concepts, and power all under its control? In the end, he could only conclude one thing: this being was utterly unstoppable. Arthur snapped the end of the beginning trigger right when a colossal skeletal monster, backed by smaller minions, came charging straight at him. The monster's skeleton lunged forward at terrifying speed, its shape smearing into motion as Arthur dug in, refusing to move. The skeletal monster flinched hard, truly rattled because Arthur's attack slipped past its legendary regeneration, and it couldn't even process how it got hit without the usual defenses. With his blade burning bright, Arthur sneered and demanded why on earth should he fear a future sword named Wolf. Canada watched Arthur's fight unfold and finally realized the enemy wasn't the real thing at all, just a broken, sub-form copy of the true entity. With a fierce glare, Arthur surged forward and shouted that Ichiro Shimizu alone was all he needed to crush his foe right behind him. A hulking skeletal monster towered and let out a gut-rattling roar. Meanwhile, Kanata watched the clash, stunned by how much quicker the master's attacks were than expected, while the skeletal monster's dark, tentacle-like appendages writhed and charged up for the strike. He kept flying through the fight, slipping past the monster's body reinforcement attack as it whipped out in a brutal, coiling strike. While he slammed his assault, the monster's armored defenses kept locking in, and Kanata watched its convergence was still getting faster in a way that didn't feel normal. Arthur felt the heat rising and decided this fight ends with one brutal, instant strike. Out of nowhere, boom, countless chains snapped into place around him, wrapping his limbs tight like they'd been there the whole time. He stared, stunned, because he never felt a thing. Then the dread hit was his opponent's movement, just a cover, and was there something bigger lurking that he hadn't noticed yet? Canada stared at his mess and said, "If these were the same chains from before, I'd have slipped out by now." She broke it down for him. Those chains Arthur felt weren't anything like what Shimizu used. These weren't just metal and flesh. They were a straight-up conceptual strike, meant to slip past your senses and trap Arthur in a way he never saw coming. As her explanation kept pouring out, she exposed the monster's real trick, a stealthy chain that would latch onto him until someone finally recognized him. Arthur stood there with smaller skeletal minions closing in, eyes locked, and the more he listened, the clearer it got. Maybe the way out was way simpler than he ever expected. As she spoke, Arthur fought like a man trapped in his own mind, thrashing against the concept chains and screaming her name in sheer fury. Each new tightening snapped shut with loud metallic clangs. She finished her assessment and said, "The monster's perception is the whole reason it can stay perfectly hidden, so Arthur's first move made sense. If he shatters that perception, the stealth binding falls apart." So even while still chained, Arthur sucked in a breath and slammed a hard, laser-focused strike into the ground, trying to wreck the monster's conceptual attack. Rage tore through his throat as he thrashed against those concept-made chains, clawing at the skeletal monster's grip to escape, and Kanata, watching the whole thing, shouted, asking if he needed help. He clenched his teeth, felt the chain tight around him, but his resolve still wouldn't snap. Trapped in those invisible chains, he suddenly surged with raw power, electric energy snapping in the air around him, and he mumbled a low thanks to Kanata, eyes blazing with pure resolve. While the examiner, Aoi, Chris, and that mysterious woman stared from afar, the examiner shouted at Akabain, then pushed Shemtin forward because Arthur was still locked in a brutal fight, getting swallowed by a non-stop swarm of skeletal and goblin monsters. Frustration hit the breaking point in Arthur's chest. He roared a guttural scream and blasted a brutal wave of energy through the battlefield, like it was ripping reality apart. A voice in his head shouted for him to destroy everything. Destruction kept blasting out of him, smashing that hulking skeletal monster to pieces, while deep inside his chest, a brutal memory clawed at his thoughts, one desperate plea ringing louder and louder. He didn't want to get hurt, and he sure as hell didn't want to be weak. Still drenched in that blazing power, his face tightened with steel. He flat out refused the idea that he was anything like Ichiro Shimizu, swearing he was his own man, built with his own strength. Rage surged back into him as he screamed, blasting his unseen tormentor for dumping their own complexes onto everyone, then calling them a fool. Arthur drove one last cataclysmic blow into the skeletal monster, and it crumpled to dust because even though the odds said this thing couldn't ever be beaten, his power didn't even flicker, defying the rules of what was impossible. Dust and wreckage whirled around him, his blade still sizzling with leftover power. Then a chilling question hit him. Did he really beat it? He let out a confident, almost taunting laugh. Then he stared down at his sword more than steel and edge, and let the weight of the wild contract he'd forged with it hit him all over again. He faced the examiner head-on, eyes blazing, as the man announced, "Master, you cleared the first trial beautifully." And Kanata backed it up with a steady voice. "If you hadn't been there, I never would have survived that battlefield." She tilted her chin up, eyes drifting far away, and whispered that it was nothing but a shadow. Even under the crushing weight of her words, he let out a relieved, "Thank you," his face lighting up with a huge smile while sweat trickled down his brow. Kanata's eyes went thoughtful as she said she'd head back now. Right before she left, he spun around and shouted, "Shimizu-kun!" While the examiner and the other observers stared at the blazing portal, he said 4 monsters were meant to be born right here today, and that the blood-soaked Holy Maiden was destined to be loved by 1,000 lies. He kept laying out the original plan. Only one examiner was supposed to stand his ground, fight like a hero, and die clutching every ounce of responsibility as the fallen one. Kanata, who'd been watching everything unfold, just grinned and said, "I'm still alive." Then she revealed the killer twist Death's god wasn't there anymore, so Rakshasa Sarama would never be born. After the trial wrapped up, he strode off with his back to the crowd, while the words, "Our victory," rang out alongside a brutal tragedy of death and corruption, closing the book on this chapter. People talked about regalia like they weren't just avatars at all. They were perfected powers sealed inside dungeons, and only the boss monsters could drop them when they finally fell. These regalia burst into the world in every shape: swords, armor, gear, even odd accessories, each one packed with insane specific powers, basically boss monster info turned into real items with their own signature skills and traits. Arthur and Kanata dove straight into how the world actually worked, and Arthur realized one thing fast. If you want adventurers, you can't recruit solo, you need a clan. And regalia aren't just brag-worthy gear. They're the lifeline. Kanata then dropped the big rule normally. Only the true owner can use a regalia, but there are exceptions. And after that, she stared at the word itself like it was a clue. Maybe regalia was just a fancy label for what bosses drop. He pressed the system again and again. So what if a regalia got confirmed as a drop for the 4th time? If that kept stacking, he figured the odds would crumble each run until they barely hit 12-5. Then he shifted gears. What happens when a boss character doesn't have a certain ability, or when they juggle multiple ones, and which regalia would actually fall from the pool of candidates? Arthur's frustration hit like a wave. He realized that even when you know an item exists, you can't grab it without the right aptitude, and that left him staring at the weird term, wolf regalia, wondering what it even was. Then he eyed the Grim Reaper regalia like it was trouble in an item slot every power. The brutal energy drain, the sneaky stealth and capture move, the way it buffs itself, the summonable skeleton tokens, and even the option to wield a Grim Reaper. While his mind raced over one chilling thought, this confirmed drop was meant for some mystery person, and it didn't sit right with him, not with Raspas looming in the background, so he shut it all down with the cold conclusion, bad omen. A whole week after the adventure exam, at 8:30 a.m., Arthur was sprawled in his room, staring at the ring on his finger, the Grim Reaper regalia, a dead god's leftover remnant, dripping with deathly power. He'd seen it. Its abilities matched its name perfectly. And as he sat up, he realized the story's wolf regalia sword might have been the original idea, but this Grim Reaper fit him way better. Then his phone erupted with Haruka-san's messages, inviting him to play meetup at the moonlit dungeon entrance around 10:30 a.m., she said. And Arthur immediately acknowledged her invite. Meanwhile, Kanata sat on her phone with disgust written all over her face, grumbling about damagey characters, while another message from a woman popped up again, so she squinted at the screen, trying to figure out why that sly smirk wouldn't leave her mind. She was fully enjoying the onajirai when Arthur bulldozed into the room and barked that she needed to knock before he came in. Then she didn't even flinch, just asked what he was really staring at. Still clutching her snack, she shot him into a headlock and, like it was nothing, told him Aoi had invited her to play. He instantly got it and nodded along. She kept eating like an angel, but deep inside she was plotting going to make a deceptive collage image and fool him, making sure he'd never realize she wasn't so easily manipulated. Moments later, Arthur and Kanata were glued to their phones. Arthur leaned into his mic, calling it a golden chance and telling everyone to believe the master and feel good about him, but Kanata heard it and recoiled with pure disgust. Her eyes burned with resolve as she kept devouring her onajirai, vowing to swallow Arthur into her own clan before any bigger clan could lay claim to him, and Arthur just stood there. Stunned, speechless. He stared down, phone still clutched in his hand, and finally admitted she was right. His eyes stayed glued to his phone as the news article hit someone was scouting him now, and it claimed that if he really was a genius from a prestigious family, finding him would be effortless, not special treatment. The broadcast kept rolling, then bam! A giant headline blared the new super absorption rule. It praised this fresh-faced adventurer for wiping out a surprise variant monster in the very first dungeon, all thanks to brand new gear, earning insane hype and pushing him to the top as the highest-scoring exam passer. And there, right on the screen, a concept image showed Arthur standing shoulder to shoulder with a happy, cheerful female adventurer. Rubbing his eyes like he'd just woken from a bad dream, Arthur stepped out of the room while Kanata watched him from the kitchen, thinking he didn't really want to draw attention, yet knowing his path was exactly where everything had been heading. Then he burst into the kitchen and ran into a woman with long, dark hair, and she looked genuinely shocked, so she demanded to know what he was up to. He shot back that he wasn't hunting a midnight snack at all. He was about to head out with a friend. And the second she heard that, her eyes widened like she couldn't believe it. Hiyoko, Arthur's female friend, hugs him tight and blurts out with pure joy that he finally has a friend. Then she grins and dares him, if he won't spend time with her, she's done being his older sister. Still clutching Arthur, she tells him his phone has nothing but family names, no friends at all, so he's basically stuck with nobody to play with. Then she heaps praise on him for all his hard work. Kyoko can't hide her worry and flat out says things are getting bad, then grabs Arthur, asks what he's doing, and insists it's a family matter before yanking him into a tight embrace and pointing out how hard he's been working lately. She even cheers that he's come home like he promised. And she's honestly thrilled because she's his older sister. Arthur, still cradled in her arms, blurts out an apology for every second he made her worry, then admits she looks fine. Yet the curse she cast on him hasn't vanished. With a soft smile, Kyoko tightens her resolve. If she wants to save her older sister for real, she's got to push herself even harder. Arthur strides into the entrance of the 27th dungeon in Sakuragi, jaw tight, as he weighs the nightmare ahead. He knows his sister's power is holding the curse at bay right now. But if he dies, their contract snaps and the curse instantly fires back to life. He keeps talking to himself, and then it hits him with a gut punch. The real danger isn't just the situation around him, it's the death flag he's carrying too. Leaning against the tree, he realizes fate isn't some foggy idea at all. There are real rules tied to calamity and malice, and they're written right on you as dungeon marks. The story flips inward, showing how the second his logic snaps, all those buried wants and urges burst out and steer him straight toward a deadly end. Because if he dies, Chris, the Holy Maiden, won't be able to break the curse. And she'll be stuck facing death too, and then Ichiro Shimizu's name hits the air, promising he'll go on a rampage however he pleases. Kyoko lies down with her eyes shut, and as her thoughts spiral, she fears that if this keeps going, even her older sister won't be able to dodge death. Death stared down at him, and Arthur sank into deep thought, trying to crack the curse he still had, trapped in an unsealed form, because he was sure he had options. Grab a panacea, use what he knew from his past games, and turn it into a real, practical item he could finally make. He knew that grabbing the elixir wouldn't be the win, it wouldn't even be close. The dungeon boss was a monstrous death god-like thing with power, speed, and firepower so brutal it crushed everything he could do alone. And no amount of strategy could carry him through that fight by himself. Still, he couldn't shake the weight of it. He refused to drag Damichi's main characters into his mess. Then his mind snapped to Shimizu and to the fate he should never have faced, right as a voice blared, "Hey, Shimizu Koen!" Suddenly, she was right in front of him, face mere inches away, so close it made his heart skip. And then Shimizu Koen, she blurted out, her voice shining with excitement. She teased him about his shocked reaction, basically daring him to admit he'd been daydreaming about her in casual clothes. Then she flashed that innocent grin and hit him with, "So, what do you really think?" When he started complimenting her, her cheeks flared with a deep blush. She could tell he meant it, and it felt so good. He said the outfit fit her perfectly, making her look mature and totally in control, then leaned in and added that her AOE, her blue, matched the clear sky so perfectly it almost felt unreal. His words burned a hotter blush into her cheeks, and she giggled, calling him a real gallant gentleman for praising her so plainly. Then she winked, flipped the moment back on him, and demanded to know what he honestly felt. With a bold, confident grin, he answered by asking her the same question right back. Then she shoved her phone in his face, and the screen lit up with pages of text scouting and recruitment stuff, and told him, right to his face, that he was a total hit too. While everything else faded, his mind snapped back to the cold strategy. Getting the panacea meant he had to build a party, and not just any party, a healer, a ranged attacker, and a specialist attacker. The truth hit him hard. He'd always been chasing one thing to save his companions, and now he was so obvious it practically screamed. He weighed what that legendary sword could mean, especially with a brand new adventurer who, out of nowhere, just crushed a mutated monster in the first dungeon, and the raw talent sitting in front of him made him feel they couldn't let them drift aimlessly. A bolt of realization hit him. His eyes snapped wide with shock. Wait, could it be me they're talking about? Kyoko, right beside him, nodded and flat out warned that if they didn't land him, they'd be throwing away something huge. Thrown off by her bold honesty, he blurted out a quick detour, suggesting they grab tea or go wherever she wanted, anything to yank the talk away from his way too unexpected popularity. She stays serious, though Hyoko tells him that before anything else, she has to properly thank him for something that might not feel like a big deal to him, but meant everything to her. And he just stares back, completely stunned by how sincere she is. He brushed off her thanks on the spot, calling it nothing more than a rescue mess and sneering that he hated how righteous things were getting, claiming he was just a selfish user who didn't need gratitude, especially since she'd helped him too. But Hyoko wouldn't have it. With a quiet, intense look on her face, she started speaking again. She let it slip that her family was old and distinguished. But the truth hit harder. Everyone was stuck obsessing over tradition and image. constantly panicking about what everyone else would think. She admitted she'd been grinding to meet every expectation until one day, a sudden message tore open a brand new path, dragging her straight back to that memory of her practicing with a sword. In that memory, an older master snapped that there was nothing left for her to learn then. Right after, her whole family hit their knees and begged her to step up as the next head of the household. She said everyone treated her like she was better, like it was some trophy worth cheering for. But that title had turned her days into pure frustration. Then she stared at Arthur and held out her hand, silently begging him to understand. She marveled at how huge the world was and how full of genuinely good people, yet she couldn't shake the fear that she'd never find something that truly grabs her, something worth throwing her whole heart into. Then her mind drifted to adventurers, the kind who roll up with their crew, smash down terrifying enemies, and carve paths into places nobody's seen, and honestly, just picturing them made her go, yeah, that's insanely cool. She leaned in and declared, loud and fearless, she was born for adventure, and that belief had sunk so deep it left her completely spellbound by the idea. Her eyes lifted, her face softened, and tears nearly spilled as the memory of that day crashed back in so she could finally take the qualification exam. She replayed the exam in her head and, yeah, it sucked a bit, but it was still kind of fun. Then, bam! A new memory hit her, getting trapped by a mutated monster, freezing in the worst kind of helplessness, feeling totally useless. And that's when it finally clicked, how huge the world really is, way bigger than she ever imagined. She snapped her gaze onto Arthur and declared that the incredible hero who just arrived was none other than him. She kept talking, saying he'd saved her, listened to her, and fought right beside her. And then she admitted she'd always longed for a solid partner to stand against terrifying enemies, wondering if she would have slipped into a cold, lonely darkness if he hadn't shown up, because before him, she'd never really felt true excitement. She grabbed Arthur's attention and thanked him, saying that with him there, she'd finally felt it in the very depths of her heart. Living is genuinely worth it. As he listened to her heartfelt words, Arthur felt that old, stubborn anxiety clawing at him from deep inside. She then grilled him on whether she was allowed to tweak his future, and he snapped back that it wouldn't change, no matter what. Then he warned her if she ever said thank you to him, it'd only be a lie. She stared at him, stunned, and blurted, sorry. What did you just say? He just shrugged and said, who knows? Arthur kept walking away with his back to her, even as she shouted his name. Then she laughed and suggested she just call him Haru, because it was so much easier. He spun around to face her and suggested she call him Ichiro, not anything else. Then she snapped back fast. San is totally unnecessary. As cherry blossoms drifted down around them, she tipped her head up to him, eyes locked in sincerity, and asked if he'd join her if he'd form a party with her. He stared down at her, arm outstretched, and begged, like it was his last shot, asking her to team up with him and form a party. She dropped to her knees in front of him, hanging on every word as he swore solemn and unshakable that he'd never bore her, because this world was packed with dreams and hope. He kept going, saying he'd spend his whole life proving he meant every word, not just because he saved her, but because being with her felt damn good. His hand shot out and gently clasped hers, sealing their promise without a single word. With his hand clamped around hers, her fingers shimmered under a gentle glow as she nodded and whispered, yes, please. She beamed through tears, staring into the future as the narrator laid it out. Dungeon entry used to be locked down, but now they're being run by someone for real, and the road ahead suddenly looks crystal clear. With their hands still locked together, the narrator declared the miracle they'd grabbed was real right then. A party of two was born,